My name is Stella. I am 33 years old. At my younger sister Madison's wedding, the venue staff stopped me right at the grand entrance. I looked past their shoulders to see my mother Caroline marching toward me with absolute disgust burning in her eyes. She grabbed my arm, pulled me out of sight of the wealthy in-laws, and hissed that they could not have a poor seamstress embarrassing the family today. I simply smiled, turned around, and told her to enjoy the day. Days later, when she opened the bridal preservation box, she found an invoice that would cost her everything. 66 missed calls followed. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who completely underestimated your true worth. It was a brisk Saturday afternoon in Manhattan, and the Waldorf Astoria looked as imposing and magnificent as ever. The gold accents, the massive crystal chandeliers, and the polished marble floors screamed old money. This was exactly the kind of atmosphere my parents were trying so desperately to align themselves with. Madison was marrying Elijah. He was a brilliant and devastatingly handsome investment banker whose family hailed from Atlanta. Elijah and his relatives were genuine African-American high society. His mother Josephine did not just have wealth. She had generational power, impeccable taste, and a fierce intolerance for anything fake or pretentious. My parents, Caroline and Harrison, were entirely out of their depth among these people, but they were determined to fake their way to the top. And in their narrow minds, I was the ultimate liability to their carefully constructed illusion of grandeur. I walked up the sweeping carpeted steps toward the main ballroom, wearing a minimalist navy blue silk slip dress. It had no flashy designer logos and no ostentatious sequins. To the untrained eye of someone obsessed with fast fashion, it looked like something bought off a clearance rack. To anyone who actually understood luxury garments, it was a masterclass in bias-cut tailoring hand-stitched in Milan. But my mother only saw what she wanted to see. Before I could even hand my embossed invitation to the usher standing at the grand double doors, Caroline intercepted me. She materialized out of the bustling crowd of elegantly dressed guests, her face powdered to perfection, but her eyes frantic with a familiar toxic rage. She grabbed my wrist hard, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin, and dragged me behind a massive floral arrangement of imported white hydrangeas. "What do you think you are doing showing up here looking like that?" Caroline hissed, her voice a harsh whisper, so the nearby valets would not overhear her outburst. I looked down at my immaculate dress, then back at her panicked face. "I am attending my sister's wedding, mother. I was invited." "You were invited out of obligation," she spat back, her eyes darting around the lobby to make sure none of Elijah's distinguished relatives were watching our interaction. "But your father and I expected you to have the common decency to stay home. Look at you. You look like a maid. Elijah's entire family is inside that room. Josephine is inside that room. Do you have any earthly idea how much money and influence is sitting in that ballroom right now? We cannot have a poor, struggling seamstress walking around and answering questions about her miserable little alteration shop. It will ruin Madison. It will ruin this entire family." I took a slow, deep breath, letting her toxic words wash over me without absorbing a single drop of their poison. For my entire adult life, my family had mocked my career. When I decided to work with fabrics instead of pursuing a corporate law degree, like they demanded, I became the ultimate black sheep. They honestly thought I spent my days hemming cheap trousers in a dusty, dimly lit basement. They had absolutely no idea that my tiny shop was actually the front for Estelle C., one of the most exclusive bridal couture houses in the entire world. I catered exclusively to billionaires, royalty, and A-list celebrities. In fact, the very dress Madison was wearing inside that ballroom right now, a breathtaking custom gown with hand-embroidered pearls and a cathedral train, was my own creation. It retailed for $150,000. "Mother," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "Madison insisted I come today to see her walk down the aisle." "Madison was just being polite because she pities you," Caroline sneered. stepping closer to intimidate me. She is terrified you are going to open your mouth and tell Josephine that you sew buttons for a living. We told Elijah's parents that you are a minor associate in the textile industry. If you walk in there wearing that cheap rag, the facade is over. Your father is currently inside trying to network with Elijah's uncles, and I will not let your failure drag down your sister on the most important day of her life. Turn around and go back to whatever hole you crawled out of. You are not welcome at this family table today. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. I saw the sheer panic in her eyes, the desperate, pathetic need to cling to a status she did not actually possess. I felt no anger in that specific moment, only a cold, clinical clarity. I had spent 33 years trying to prove my worth to people who were firmly committed to misunderstanding me. I was finally done playing the victim. I gently but firmly pulled my wrist from her harsh grasp. I smoothed out the invisible wrinkles on my silk dress. "You are exactly right, Mother," I said, maintaining a polite, chilling smile. "I would absolutely hate to ruin the beautiful illusion you have worked so hard to build today. Have a wonderful day. Please tell Madison she looked beautiful in her gown." Caroline let out a dismissive scoff, already turning her back on me to rush back to the flowing champagne and the flashing cameras. She did not notice the heavy irony of my parting words. She did not know that she was the legal guarantor on the contract for that spectacular bridal gown. She did not know about the strict morality clause buried deep in the fine print of that legally binding contract. A clause that explicitly stated any disparagement or abusive behavior toward the designer would instantly revoke the massive family discount I had secretly applied to the purchase. I walked out of the Waldorf Astoria with my head held high, breathing in the crisp city air. I bypassed the standard taxi line and walked 2 blocks down the street to where my private driver was waiting patiently in my luxury SUV. I slid into the buttery leather back seat, pulled out my phone, and opened my secure business management portal. I sent a single devastating message to my boutique manager. Activate the penalty clause on Madison's account. Revoke all discounts immediately. Print the invoice. The game of pretending to be small was finally over, and the real consequences for my family were just beginning. 3 months before the incident at the Waldorf Astoria, I was sitting at the polished mahogany table in my parents' dining room. The air was thick with the scent of roasted lamb and the suffocating weight of my mother's expectations. I had been summoned for a mandatory Sunday dinner, an event I usually tried to avoid. But Madison had just officially announced her engagement to Elijah, and attendance was strictly required. Madison was holding court at the center of the table, waving her left hand so the massive diamond caught the light from the chandelier overhead. She could not stop talking about Elijah's family. She went on and on about their sprawling estate in Atlanta, their exclusive philanthropic galas, and how his mother Josephine intimidated everyone with her effortless aristocratic grace. Madison was practically vibrating with the thrill of marrying into true wealth, completely blind to the fact that her own family was drowning in debt just to maintain a facade of upper-middle-class success. "I need everything to be absolutely flawless," Madison declared, taking a delicate sip of her wine. "Josephine's friends will be scrutinizing every single detail of this wedding. I cannot just walk down the aisle in some basic off-the-rack gown. I need an Estelle C. creation. It is the only brand that screams true exclusivity." My father Harrison coughed nervously into his napkin. "Estelle C. I read about them in a financial magazine. Do they not have a 2-year waiting list just for a consultation?" Madison rolled her eyes, her spoiled entitlement shining through. "I already pulled some strings and begged a bridal concierge to get me an expedited appointment. But the dress I want, the only dress that will prove I belong in Elijah's world, costs $150,000. And they require payment up front." The table went dead silent. Even my parents, who normally indulged Madison's every whim, looked physically ill at the mention of that number. They had already taken out a second mortgage on their house, just to fund the extravagant catering and floral arrangements for the rehearsal dinner. They were financially tapped out. Caroline slowly turned her head, her gaze landing squarely on me. I felt the familiar sickening drop in my stomach. I knew exactly what that predatory look meant. I had seen it 1,000 times before. Whenever the family needed a scapegoat or a financial sacrifice, I was the designated victim. Stella. My mother began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that barely masked her underlying malice. You have been sitting there awfully quiet. As the older sister, you have a duty to contribute to this momentous occasion. I set my fork down very carefully. I am already paying for the bridesmaid dresses and the bridal shower mother. I think I have contributed plenty. Madison scoffed loudly, crossing her arms over her chest. Oh, please, Stella. You bought those cheap dresses wholesale. You run a dingy little alteration shop. You practically live in a basement surrounded by fabric scraps. It is not like you have a real mortgage or a husband to support. You have zero actual expenses. Caroline slammed her hand on the table, making the silverware rattle. Do not speak to your sister like that, Madison, she said, putting on a brief show of maternal fairness before turning the knife on me. But your sister is right, Stella. You have never achieved anything of substance. You sit alone in your little shop sewing hems for pennies, while Madison is elevating our entire family name by marrying Elijah. You owe her this. You owe us this. I stared at them, absorbing the sheer audacity of their demand. They wanted me to fund a 6-figure wedding gown while simultaneously degrading the very profession they thought I was failing at. They wanted my money, but they wanted me to feel worthless while giving it to them. I do not have $150,000 sitting in a checking account, I said calmly, stating a fact that would align with their perception of me. I am not asking for cash. Caroline snapped, her patience evaporating. Put it on your credit cards. Max them out if you have to. Take out a business loan against your miserable little shop. You will figure it out. Consider it compensation for all the embarrassment your lack of a real career has caused your father and me over the years. This is your chance to finally be useful. The absolute cruelty of her words hung in the air. A normal daughter might have cried. A normal daughter might have screamed and stormed out of the house. But I was not a normal daughter anymore. I was a highly successful businesswoman who had learned to suppress her emotions in order to execute a perfect strategy. I looked at Madison, who was smirking triumphantly, already visualizing herself in the gown. Then I looked at Caroline, whose face was flushed with the exertion of bullying her eldest child. I let out a long, defeated sigh, playing the role of the broken, subservient daughter they demanded I be. Fine. I will pay for the dress. I will go to the boutique and put my credit card on file. Madison's squeal of delight echoed off the dining room walls. Caroline smiled smugly, leaning back in her chair like a queen who had just successfully taxed a rebellious peasant. However, I added softly, leaning forward and lowering my voice to sound hesitant and ashamed. My credit score is not exactly stellar, Mother. You know my business barely makes ends meet. My credit limit is far too low to be approved for a luxury purchase of that magnitude. The boutique uses a very strict third-party financing and verification system for custom gowns. They will decline my card instantly unless I have a guarantor with a solid asset portfolio to back up the purchase. Caroline rolled her eyes, exasperated by my supposed financial incompetence. You cannot even manage a simple credit line correctly. You are truly useless, Stella. Fine. What do you need me to do? I just need you to sign the guarantor agreement as the secondary party, I explained, keeping my expression perfectly innocent. It is just a formality. The boutique simply needs to know that if my card somehow bounces or my shop goes bankrupt, someone with real assets is listed on the paperwork. But do not worry. I will make all the monthly payments myself. You will not have to pay a single cent. Caroline waved her hand dismissively, eager to end the conversation and secure the gown for her golden child. Bring me the paperwork tomorrow. I will sign whatever they need. It is just a formality anyway. She agreed without a single second of hesitation. She was so blinded by her own arrogance, so eager to secure a status symbol for Madison, that she did not even consider the legal implications of what she was doing. She firmly believed I was a terrified, pathetic seamstress who would spend the rest of my life working myself to the bone to pay off her debts. She had no idea that I was the sole owner of Estelle C. She had no idea that she was legally binding herself to my company, putting her home, her savings, and her entire false reality on the line. I picked up my wine glass and took a slow sip, hiding the cold, victorious smile that threatened to break across my face. The trap was set, and my mother had just eagerly stepped right into it. The Estelle C. Boutique on Fifth Avenue was a fortress of modern luxury. Frosted glass white marble floors and racks of gowns that looked like they were spun from actual starlight. Madison practically vibrated with manic energy when we walked through the towering double doors. Caroline strutted in right behind her, acting as though she personally owned the building. I walked in last wearing a plain beige trench coat, keeping my head down. Penelope, the boutique manager, approached us with 2 flutes of expensive champagne for my mother and sister, and a polite, neutral nod for me. I caught the micro-expression in Penelope's eyes, a fleeting look of absolute reverence, before she masked it with standard retail professionalism. I had texted her beforehand to treat me exactly like a random low-income relative paying the bill. She played her part flawlessly. Madison demanded to see the exclusive bridal collection. Penelope guided them to the VIP fitting suite, an expansive room with plush velvet seating and a pedestal surrounded by 360-degree mirrors. For the next 2 hours, I sat quietly on a small corner stool while Madison paraded around in gowns that cost more than most luxury vehicles. Caroline sipped her champagne, loudly criticizing the invisible flaws in my own outfit while praising Madison to the heavens. She made sure to remind me every 5 minutes how grateful I should be just to breathe the same air as these garments. Finally, Madison settled on the masterpiece. It was a handcrafted silk organza ball gown featuring intricate pearl embroidery that my design team had spent 400 hours assembling. The price tag was exactly $150,000. Penelope brought the digital tablet over to the velvet sofa where my mother was sitting. She placed it carefully on the glass coffee table. As requested, we have prepared the financing agreement. Penelope said, her tone perfectly even. Since this is an expedited custom order, we require the payment terms to be locked in today. The primary payer is listed as Stella with a specialized benefactor discount applied to the total balance. Caroline scoffed loudly, crossing her legs. Benefactor discount? You mean her maxed out credit cards? Just show me where to sign so we can get out of here. I cannot stand breathing in this much tulle. It gives me a headache to see things Stella could never afford to wear. I stood up and walked over to the table. I need to make sure the financing terms are correct before you co-sign, Mother. I scrolled through the digital document, pointing to a specific block of text. The boutique requires a secondary guarantor because my income bracket is deemed high risk. If my payments fail, you are legally responsible for the full $150,000. Caroline rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. I know what a guarantor is, Stella. I am not an idiot. I own a house. I have assets. Just give me the pen. But she did not read the fine print. She did not scroll down to the addendum I had personally instructed my legal team to draft and embed into the standard sales contract. It was a strictly enforced morality clause. In high-stakes luxury retail, morality clauses are sometimes used to protect the brand's image from disgraceful clients. But I had tailored this one specifically for the payer and guarantor dynamic. The clause was incredibly explicit under United States contract law. It stated that the $150,000 balance was fully subsidized by a private benefactor discount. However, if the client or the guarantor engaged in any behavior that constituted public disparagement, emotional abuse, or defamation toward the primary payer, the discount would be immediately and irrevocably voided. In the event of a breach, the guarantor would assume immediate liability for the entire $150,000 plus a 20% penalty fee for breach of contract payable within 48 hours. Failure to pay would result in an immediate lien placed upon the guarantor's primary residence. It was an airtight, lethal legal trap. And it was sitting right there in 10-point font beneath her manicured fingertips. Are you sure you do not want to read the terms, Mother? I asked, offering her one last fake lifeline. It is a legally binding financial document. Caroline snatched the digital stylus out of my hand. Do not lecture me on finance, you pathetic little seamstress. I have been managing real money since before you were born. You are just trying to stall because you are terrified of the commitment. You are terrified of actually doing something valuable for your sister for once in your life. She quickly scrawled her signature across the bottom of the screen. The tablet chimed, locking the contract into the secure server. The digital ink dried legally, binding her house and her future to my absolute mercy. Penelope took the tablet back, holding it tightly against her chest. Her perfectly painted red lips twitched. She looked at me, then looked at Caroline. Thank you, madam. The contract is fully executed. Your gown will be ready exactly on time. Caroline stood up, grabbing her designer handbag. Finally. Let us go, Madison. The air in here is getting stale. She turned to look at me, scanning me up and down with sheer disgust. Try not to ruin the wedding photos with your depressing aura, Stella. And make sure you actually pay your credit card bill on time. I will not have my credit score dragged down by a failure. She marched toward the exit, Madison trailing behind her, practically skipping with joy over her stolen luxury gown. I lingered behind for just a second. I looked at Penelope and the two other fitting assistants standing near the pedestal. They were biting the insides of their cheeks, their faces turning red from the physical effort of holding back their laughter. They knew exactly who I was. They knew they had just watched an arrogant woman blindly sign away her financial freedom while insulting the very billionaire who owned the building they were standing in. I gave Penelope a slow, deliberate nod. Upload the signed contract to the legal department, I instructed quietly. And keep it ready. The trap was armed, the countdown had begun, and my mother had happily handed me the detonator. The bridal shower was held in the sunlit conservatory of a highly exclusive country club. The massive room was dripping in cascading white orchids, imported crystal fixtures, and the suffocating scent of expensive perfume. Caroline and Madison were hovering around Josephine, like desperate moths drawn to a blinding, wealthy flame. Josephine sat perfectly upright in a high-backed wicker chair. She wore a tailored emerald green suit that commanded absolute respect, without shouting for attention. Her presence alone elevated the room, creating a stark contrast to my mother and sister, who wore overly ruffled pastel dresses that screamed new money, trying entirely too hard. I was not allowed to sit down and enjoy the afternoon. Caroline had shoved a heavy silver tray into my hands the moment I walked through the double doors, instructing me to make myself useful since I did not belong mingling with the elite guests. So I spent the entire afternoon circulating the room, collecting discarded cocktail napkins, clearing away half-eaten appetizers, and offering fresh glasses of champagne to women who looked right through me. Every time I passed my family, I could hear Caroline laughing too loudly at Josephine's polite remarks, desperately trying to cement her place in this new social hierarchy. Halfway through the event, Josephine gracefully opened her designer handbag and produced an antique velvet jewelry box. She handed it to Madison. The entire conservatory went dead silent. Madison eagerly popped open the lid and let out a dramatic, breathless gasp for the cameras. Inside rested a breathtaking diamond and sapphire collar necklace that caught the sunlight and fractured it across the walls. This has been in Elijah's family for 4 generations, Josephine said, her voice smooth, measured and carrying the weight of deep Southern aristocracy. It is traditionally worn by the brides who marry into our lineage. We welcome you to the family, Madison. Madison immediately started manufacturing fake tears. She clasped her hands over her chest and gushed about how honored she was to wear such a prestigious piece of history. Caroline looked like she might pass out from the sheer proximity to such immense tangible wealth. She practically bowed to Josephine, loudly praising the matriarch's exquisite taste and unmatched generosity to anyone who would listen. I stood quietly in the background near the kitchen doors, loading sticky dessert plates onto my tray, watching the performance unfold. An hour later, Madison stood at the front of the room, under a massive floral arch, to make a formal toast. She clinked a silver spoon against her crystal flute, demanding the undivided attention of every wealthy socialite in attendance. She thanked Josephine extensively, praised Elijah, and then pivoted to announcing her official bridal party. She listed off 4 of her wealthy sorority friends, all of whom squealed and rushed forward to hug her. Then Madison stopped and looked directly at me. I was standing near the catering station holding a black plastic trash bag full of torn wrapping paper and discarded ribbons. And of course, Madison announced, her voice projecting clearly across the silent conservatory, so every single guest could hear her. Many of you might be wondering why my own older sister is not standing up there with me as a bridesmaid today. All eyes turned to me. The heavy, suffocating weight of public scrutiny settled over the room. Caroline smiled approvingly from her seat next to Josephine, crossing her legs and waiting for the punchline. "I love Stella dearly," Madison continued, her tone dripping with fake condescending pity. "But we have to be realistic about the expectations for a wedding of this caliber. The bridesmaid gowns I have selected are imported couture. They require a certain level of sophistication and financial commitment. Stella works at a very small, struggling alteration shop. She simply does not have the money to buy a dress worthy of this occasion. I could never force her into massive debt just to stand next to me, and I certainly cannot have a cheap, off-the-rack distraction ruining the aesthetic of Elijah's society wedding. So she will be supporting me from the background today by cleaning up just as she will on the wedding day." A few of the guests exchanged highly uncomfortable glances. Some offered me looks of deep, humiliating pity. I felt the burning sting of their stares, but I kept my face entirely impassive. I simply nodded, tied the trash bag shut, and placed it in the receptacle. This was exactly the kind of public disparagement that triggered the breach of contract. I reached into the deep pocket of my slacks to ensure my phone was still running its audio recording app. The red light was blinking steadily. As I turned to gather the last stack of empty gift boxes near Josephine's chair, a sharp edge of a cardboard box caught the fabric of my pocket. The small leather-bound sketchbook I always carried slipped out and hit the marble floor. It landed face up, falling open right at Josephine's feet. Before I could reach down to retrieve it, Josephine leaned forward and picked it up. Her eyes fell upon the open page. It was a highly detailed, intricate sketch of a bridal gown silhouette, complete with structural notations for corsetry boning and hand-draped silk organza. It was a concept piece for my upcoming Paris Fashion Week collection. Josephine's eyes widened slightly. Her perfectly manicured finger traced the air above the drawing. "This is absolutely extraordinary," she murmured, her voice carrying a tone of genuine shock and deep admiration. "The vision here is impeccable. The understanding of fabric movement and structural integrity is on par with the top designers in Europe. Who drew this?" She looked up, locking her sharp, intelligent eyes with mine. Before I could open my mouth to answer, Caroline lunged forward and snatched the sketchbook right out of Josephine's hands. She slammed it shut and shoved it forcefully against my chest, her face red with panic. "Oh, please do not encourage her, Josephine," Caroline scoffed, letting out a loud, grating laugh that echoed awkwardly in the quiet space. "Stella just traces things she sees in high-end fashion magazines. She is a delusional wannabe seamstress who thinks sketching in a little book makes her a real designer. She has absolutely zero original talent. Just ignore her little doodles." Josephine frowned deeply. Her sharp gaze shifted from Caroline's frantic, dismissive face back to my calm, unbothered expression. The matriarch was far too intelligent to miss the underlying cruelty and the blatant lie, but she maintained her polite, aristocratic silence. I took my sketchbook back, sliding it safely into my coat. I gave Josephine a polite, respectful bow of my head. "Thank you for the compliment, ma'am," I said softly. I turned and walked toward the kitchen doors. As soon as I was out of sight in the service hallway, I pulled out my phone and stopped the voice recording. I saved the audio file and immediately uploaded it to my encrypted cloud drive. I had captured every single word. Madison publicly stripping me of my dignity because of my supposed poverty. Caroline loudly declaring I was a delusional, talentless wannabe in front of their most important guest. The evidence was completely flawless. The morality clause in the contract was practically humming with legal power. My mother and sister thought they were burying me under their towering egos, but they were just aggressively digging their own financial graves. 2 days after the bridal shower, I was standing in the private tailoring wing of my flagship store. The heavy oak door was locked. I was surrounded by yards of imported French lace and the quiet hum of my design team working in the adjacent rooms. My phone buzzed on the glass cutting table, the screen lit up with my father's name. Harrison rarely called me. When he did, it was never to ask how my day was going. It was always a transaction. I pressed answer and put the phone on speaker, continuing to carefully pin a silk bodice. "Stella, we have a massive crisis and you need to fix it immediately," Harrison barked. There was no greeting. His voice was tight, breathless, and laced with the frantic panic of a man who was watching his financial house of cards begin to topple. "What kind of crisis?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "Your mother made a slight miscalculation with the floral budget for the main reception," he said, pacing heavily on the other end of the line. "She promised Josephine that the entire Waldorf ballroom would be draped in imported white peonies to match the overarching aesthetic. The vendor just called and demanded the final payment before delivery. We are $20,000 short. I need you to wire the money to my account by 5 o'clock today." I stopped pinning the fabric. "You want me to give you $20,000 for flowers?" I asked, letting a note of staged disbelief enter my voice. "Do not play dumb with me," Stella Harrison snapped. "We have already drained our liquid assets to cover the rehearsal dinner and the luxury car rentals. Our credit lines are temporarily frozen due to some banking error. You have a retirement account, do you not? You have savings from that little sewing business of yours. Liquidate it. Call your bank and authorize an emergency withdrawal right now." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The sheer audacity was staggering. They had taken out a second mortgage, maxed out their credit, and were now demanding I empty my supposed meager life savings just to impress a family that already saw right through them. "I do not have $20,000 to throw away on dying flowers, Father," I replied smoothly. "And even if I did, withdrawing from a retirement fund incurs massive tax penalties. I cannot afford to bankrupt myself for a floral arrangement." The line went dead quiet for a fraction of a second before Harrison completely exploded. "You ungrateful, selfish little brat," he roared. His voice echoed off the pristine white walls of my studio. "This is exactly why you are a complete failure in life. You have absolutely no concept of family loyalty or long-term investment. We are securing your sister's future with a dynasty, and you are whining about tax penalties on a worthless savings account. Do you understand who Josephine is? She is on the board of 3 major banks. If we do not deliver exactly what we promised, she will look down on us. She will think we are poor. I will not have my reputation ruined because my eldest daughter is a stingy, small-minded loser." I let him yell. I let the recording software on my secure server capture every single venomous word. "You are 33 years old, and you have nothing to show for it." Harrison sneered, his tone dropping into a vicious, calculated growl designed to tear down my self-esteem. "You sit in a dusty room all day fixing torn dresses for pennies. You have no husband, no status, and no future. You are a bitter, miserable woman who cannot stand to see her younger sister get everything she deserves. You are jealous, Stella. You are so eaten up with jealousy over Madison marrying into a billionaire family that you are actively trying to sabotage her wedding day just to make yourself feel better about your empty life." "I am not sabotaging anything," I said quietly, playing the perfect victim. "I just cannot give you money I do not have." "Do not lie to me," he shouted. "You are just holding a grudge because you know Madison is the daughter we are actually proud of. She is beautiful, she is ambitious, and she knows how to elevate this family. What have you ever done for us? You are a dead weight. You have been a disappointment since the day you chose to be a glorified tailor instead of getting a real corporate job. I am giving you a chance to finally be useful, to actually contribute to a family that has tolerated your mediocrity for years. I swear to you, Stella, if you do not do this, I will make sure your little business goes under. I will tell everyone we know that you are untrustworthy. I will ruin your reputation in this city, and you are throwing it in my face." I picked up my fabric scissors, admiring the gleaming steel. I will not drain my accounts for your flowers, father. Harrison let out a harsh, cruel laugh. Fine. Keep your pathetic little savings. But actions have consequences, Stella. Since you refuse to act like family, you will no longer be treated like family. Your mother and I have already made adjustments to the seating chart for the reception. You will not be sitting at the main family table with us and Elijah's parents. We cannot risk having a bitter, resentful failure bringing down the mood. We are putting you at a table in the back corner near the kitchen doors with the vendors and the plus ones we do not care about. I smiled. The back corner near the kitchen. That was exactly where I wanted to be. Out of sight, observing the carnage. I understand, I said meekly. And listen to me very carefully. Harrison added, his voice dripping with absolute malice. If you do not wire that $20,000 by tomorrow morning, you can forget about attending the reception altogether. If you show up empty-handed, I will personally have the Waldorf Astoria security team drag you out by your cheap dress and throw you onto the street. You will be dead to us. Do not test me, Stella. You are a useless embarrassment to this family, and I will not let you ruin our image. Have the money ready, or do not bother showing your face. He hung up the phone. The sharp dial tone echoed in the quiet room. I did not cry. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness. I reached over, saved the audio file, and attached it directly to the digital dossier I had already sent to my attorney, Dominic. The recorded evidence of financial extortion, verbal abuse, and explicit disparagement was now entirely undeniable. Harrison had just driven the final nail into his own coffin. The morality clause was not just breached, it was obliterated. I locked my phone, turned back to my design table, and began measuring the final cuts of silk for my upcoming Paris collection. They wanted to hide me in the back of the room like garbage. They had no idea I was the one holding the match that was about to burn their entire fake empire to the ground. The final fitting was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 48 hours before Madison was set to walk down the aisle. The VIP suite at Estelle C was prepared flawlessly, matching my strict operational standards. The lighting was adjusted to mimic the soft, romantic glow of a cathedral. The temperature was set to a comfortable 68 degrees. A bottle of imported vintage champagne rested in a silver bucket of crushed ice. Madison swept into the boutique with Caroline trailing behind her like a loyal foot soldier. From the very second they crossed the threshold, Madison was an absolute nightmare. She snapped her fingers at the junior stylists, demanding they carry her designer bags. When Penelope offered her a flute of champagne, Madison took one sip and wrinkled her nose in disgust, loudly complaining that it was not chilled to her exact preference. She treated my highly trained, incredibly talented staff like they were incompetent servants. When the seamstresses carefully brought out the finished gown, a breathtaking cascade of silk and pearls, Madison did not offer a single word of gratitude. Instead, she immediately began to nitpick. She complained that the corset felt too restrictive, completely ignorant of the fact that couture boning is designed for structure, not lounging. She commanded a senior tailor to adjust a microscopic fold in the train, speaking to the woman as if she were a misbehaving child. My staff, consummate professionals, maintained their polite smiles and accommodated her ridiculous demands without a single complaint. They knew the protocol. They also knew exactly who was watching. I was sitting less than 20 feet away. My private design office was located directly adjacent to the VIP fitting suite, separated only by a large soundproof two-way mirror. From the fitting room side, it looked like a massive, elegant architectural feature meant to make the space feel larger. From my side, it was a crystal-clear window into Madison's unhinged behavior. I sat in my plush leather chair, sipping a cup of Earl Grey tea, my legs casually crossed. I watched my sister twirl in front of the mirrors, admiring her own reflection with a sickening level of narcissism. Caroline stood in the background, clapping her hands and wiping away fake tears, declaring that the wealthy in-laws would be absolutely paralyzed with jealousy when they saw her. As the tailors made the final unnecessary adjustments just to appease her ego, Madison picked up her phone. My personal cell phone vibrated on the desk in front of me. I looked through the glass, watching her dial my number. I took a slow sip of tea, cleared my throat to ensure my voice sounded adequately subdued, and answered the call. Stella Madison chirped, her voice dripping with artificial pity and intense arrogance. I just had to call you. I am standing in the Estelle C boutique right now for my final fitting. I really wish you could see this, but I know they do not let just anyone walk off the street into a place like this. I am sure you look very nice, Madison, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat. I watched her through the glass. She was smirking at her own reflection, running her hands down the silk bodice. Nice is an understatement. She laughed cruelly. I look like absolute royalty. You know, it is a shame you decided to be so difficult about Dad's floral budget yesterday. If you had just been a team player and handed over your little savings account, I might have sent you a picture of the dress. But since you are being so stubborn and selfish, you will just have to use your imagination. Have you ever even seen real haute couture up close, Stella? I mean, actually touched it. I know you work with cheap polyester and discount lace all day in your basement, but this fabric is like water. It is a masterpiece. You will never ever touch something like this in your entire miserable life. I looked at my own hands, the very hands that had sketched the silhouette, selected the silk, and spent hours hand-sewing the intricate pearl appliques on the bodice she was currently wearing. I imagine it is very beautiful, I said softly, playing my role to absolute perfection. It is beyond beautiful. Madison sneered, her voice turning sharp and vicious. It is the dress of a woman who actually matters. A woman who is marrying into power. I am stepping into a billionaire dynasty tomorrow, Stella. You are going to be sitting in the back corner near the kitchen doors, wearing whatever cheap rag you managed to scrape together, watching me become everything you failed to be. Try not to cry into the appetizers. It is pathetic. She hung up without waiting for a response. I lowered my phone and set it on the desk. Through the glass, I watched her toss her device onto the velvet sofa, turn to Caroline, and burst into a fit of cruel, victorious laughter. She truly believed she had won. She firmly believed she had crushed my spirit and solidified her place at the absolute top of the social hierarchy. She had no idea that her vicious phone call had just been automatically recorded and backed up to the same legal dossier as my father's extortion attempt. Penelope carefully unbuttoned the gown, packing it with expert precision into the signature Estelle C preservation box. They sealed it with the thick satin ribbon and handed it over to Caroline. The women strutted out of the boutique, their heads held high, absolutely radiating unearned arrogance. I remained in my quiet, dimly lit office finishing my tea. I looked at the digital file on my monitor containing the final unadjusted invoice for $185,000. The trap was not just set anymore. The steel jaws were locked, loaded, and waiting for the trigger. Tomorrow was the wedding. Everything was in perfect position for the ultimate reveal. The black luxury SUV glided smoothly away from the Waldorf Astoria, leaving the chaos and the cruelty of my family far behind me. I sat in the spacious, quiet leather back seat, watching the Manhattan skyline blur past the tinted windows. My phone remained completely silent on the seat next to me. There was not a single text from my father asking where I was. There was not a single call from my mother apologizing for her abhorrent behavior at the grand entrance. They had successfully discarded their greatest embarrassment, or so they firmly believed. My private driver navigated through the city traffic and eventually pulled into the highly secure underground parking garage of my residential building in Tribeca. This was an exclusive, heavily guarded building where tech billionaires, hedge fund managers, and international royalty maintained their primary city residences. My parents could not even afford the monthly maintenance fees for the lobby, let alone a unit here. The private elevator scanned my biometric data and carried me directly up to the penthouse floor. I stepped out of the elevator and into my actual reality. The penthouse spanned 5,000 square feet of polished white marble, soaring ceilings, and unobstructed panoramic views of the city skyline. It was a meticulously designed space radiating quiet luxury and absolute peace, purchased entirely in cash with the profits from my global couture empire. I walked into my expansive master suite and shed the simple navy slip dress that had caused my mother such intense, humiliating panic. I hung it carefully in a custom cedar closet filled with garments that cost more than my parents' entire remaining mortgage. I stepped into the glass-enclosed rainfall shower, letting the hot water wash away the toxic energy of the afternoon. When I stepped out, I wrapped myself in a heavy floor-length robe made of pure imported mulberry silk. It was a rich burgundy color hand, stitched by one of my master tailors in Paris. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of vintage Bordeaux, and sat down at the massive oak dining table. I was not crying. I was not mourning the loss of a family that had never truly loved me. I was simply preparing for business. I opened my laptop and logged into the highly encrypted backend of the Estelle C financial system. I navigated directly to the specialized accounts dashboard. Penelope, my brilliant boutique manager, had followed my instructions to the absolute letter. The system showed a bright green confirmation checkmark next to Madison's custom bridal gown order. Right below it, the penalty protocol was fully engaged and locked. The digital ledger detailed the exact timeline of events. The moment my mother had physically grabbed my arm and verbally disparaged my career outside the Waldorf Astoria, the morality clause was triggered. My private security team, discreetly positioned across the street, had recorded the entire interaction with high-definition audio. The recording of Caroline calling me a poor seamstress and permanently banning me from the venue was already uploaded to the legal file and verified by my attorney Dominic. I clicked on the final invoice tab. The numbers were beautiful in their brutal, undeniable honesty. $150,000 for the custom gown, a 20% penalty fee for the egregious breach of contract. The grand total sat at exactly $185,000. There was no negotiation allowed. There were no payment plans. The system had automatically frozen the account, preventing any further adjustments without my direct biometric authorization. The United States contract laws protecting luxury retail agreements were incredibly strict, and my legal team had ensured this particular contract was an impenetrable fortress of liability. But the digital invoice was only the secondary mechanism of my revenge. The true masterpiece of this entire operation was the physical delivery. During that agonizing final fitting, when Madison was busy mocking my supposedly miserable life, I had instructed Penelope to place a very specific item inside the bridal preservation kit. Bridal gowns of that extreme caliber are delivered with a specialized temperature-controlled storage box for the bride to use immediately after the reception. At the very bottom of that luxurious satin-lined box, hidden beneath the layers of acid-free tissue paper, rested a thick envelope sealed with the signature Estelle C red wax stamps. Inside that envelope was the printed invoice and a formally drafted legal notice from Dominic. The notice clearly explained the immediate revocation of the benefactor discount and the impending lien on Caroline's primary residence if the massive balance remained unpaid for exactly 48 hours. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my wine and looked out over the glittering city lights. Miles away inside the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria, my family was putting on the performance of a lifetime. I could vividly imagine the sickening scene. Caroline was likely hovering around Josephine, laughing too loudly, desperately trying to project an image of generational wealth. Harrison was undoubtedly cornering Elijah's influential uncles, handing out business cards he could not afford to print, trying to secure investments to save his sinking company. And Madison was the center of attention, floating across the dance floor in a masterpiece of silk and pearls that she firmly believed she had secured for free. They were drinking expensive champagne, eating catered lobster, and celebrating their successful infiltration into high society. They felt completely invincible. They felt as though they had finally won the ultimate prize and successfully hidden their greatest shame by locking me out of the building. They thought they were untouchable. They had absolutely no idea that their entire world was currently built on fragile quicksand. While they were busy drowning in the fake luxury of the wedding reception, posing for glamorous photographs, and toasting to a fraudulent future, that bright red invoice was resting quietly inside the preservation box in the bridal suite. It was a silent, ticking time bomb just waiting for them to open it the very next morning. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the presidential bridal suite at the Waldorf Astoria. The sprawling room was a chaotic monument to excess and manufactured success. Empty bottles of imported French champagne littered the mahogany side tables. Discarded designer heels and discarded tuxedo ties were scattered across the plush Persian rugs. Madison sat right in the center of the massive king-sized bed, wearing a white silk robe with her new monogram embroidered on the pocket in gold thread. She was positively glowing with the arrogant satisfaction of a woman who believed she had finally secured her place among the untouchable elite. Caroline sat in a velvet armchair near the window, nursing a slight headache but radiating absolute triumph. They were surrounded by a literal mountain of wedding gifts. Silver platters from heritage brands, crystal vases, and thick envelopes filled with generous checks from Elijah's wealthy relatives. Caroline was diligently recording every single gift in a leather-bound notebook, mentally calculating the financial haul of the previous night. It was the most perfect evening in the history of this city, Caroline declared, taking a sip of black coffee. Josephine actually introduced me to a state senator, Madison. A senator. We have officially arrived, and thank heaven I had the presence of mind to intercept your sister at the door. Can you even imagine the disaster if Stella had walked into that ballroom wearing that cheap, tragic little dress? She would have stuck out like a sore thumb. Elijah's family would have realized she was just a common seamstress, and they would have judged us immediately. Madison laughed cruelly, tearing the silver wrapping paper off another heavy box. I did not even think about Stella once the reception started. She is probably sitting in her dusty basement right now, crying over her sewing machine. We pulled it off, Mother. We actually pulled it off. I am a billionaire's wife now. I am never wearing anything off the rack ever again. Caroline smiled warmly at her golden child, completely secure in her delusion. Her eyes drifted to the corner of the suite. Resting on a polished luggage stand was the massive, pristine white Estelle C preservation box. The boutique concierge team had delivered it seamlessly the night before, ready to safely store the magnificent silk and pearl gown. The box itself was a work of art, tied with a thick, luxurious satin ribbon. I should pack your gown away before housekeeping arrives, Caroline said, setting her coffee cup down. We need to preserve it perfectly. It is a family heirloom now. You can pass it down to your daughter. It is the ultimate symbol of our new status. Caroline walked over to the preservation box. She untied the heavy satin ribbon with deep reverence. She carefully lifted the sturdy white lid, admiring the immaculate layers of acid-free tissue paper that protected the delicate silk organza and the thousands of hand-stitched pearls. She sighed happily, running her manicured fingers over the expensive fabric. It was the physical manifestation of her successful deception. But as her hand brushed against the bottom of the box, her fingers caught on something stiff, hidden beneath the final layer of tissue paper. Caroline frowned slightly. She reached down and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope made of heavy, expensive cardstock. It was sealed with a prominent dark red wax stamp bearing the unmistakable Estelle C insignia. "Look at this, Madison," Caroline said, a delighted smile returning to her face. The boutique left a private note in the box. It is probably a certificate of authenticity or a personalized congratulatory message from the designer. They know exactly how to treat their high society clients. This is why you pay for true luxury. Caroline broke the red wax seal with her thumb. She pulled out the sharply folded documents inside. There were 2 pieces of paper. The first was a formal letter printed on heavy legal stationery. The second was a bright, glaringly red invoice. Caroline adjusted her posture and began to read the first page. Her eyes scanned the elegant black text. As she read, the delighted smile on her face began to slowly melt away, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. Notice of immediate breach of contract and revocation of benefactor discount. The header read in bold, unforgiving letters. Caroline blinked hard, thinking it was some sort of bizarre administrative error. She read the next paragraph aloud, her voice wavering slightly. To the primary guarantor Caroline, be advised that at 2 o'clock post-meridian on the date of the wedding, you engaged in explicit verbal disparagement and abusive behavior toward the primary payer and owner of the Estelle C. brand, Stella. Your actions, specifically blocking her entry to the venue, calling her a poor seamstress, and forcibly removing her from the premises, were recorded and verified by our legal and security teams. These actions constitute a direct and undeniable violation of the morality clause embedded in your financing agreement. Caroline's hands started to tremble. The heavy paper rattled audibly in the quiet suite. Madison looked up from her gifts, her brow furrowing in annoyance. "Mother, what are you talking about? Stop reading that nonsense. What does it mean?" Caroline could not answer. Her vocal cords seemed perfectly paralyzed. She moved the first page to look at the bright red invoice underneath. The numbers printed on the page were massive, stark, and utterly terrifying. Total balance, due for custom bridal gown, $150,000. Penalty for breach of contract, $35,000. Total amount due. Immediately $185,000. Beneath that devastating number was a final legally binding warning drafted by Dominic. As the signed guarantor, you are wholly and independently liable for this balance. You have exactly 48 hours to remit payment in full. Failure to provide $185,000 within this timeframe will result in the immediate filing of a property lien against your primary residence. Your mortgaged property will be seized to satisfy the debt. There is no right to appeal. The air was violently sucked out of the room. The luxurious walls of the Waldorf Astoria suite suddenly felt like a rapidly shrinking prison cell. Caroline tried to take a breath, but her chest was locked tight with a suffocating, icy panic. The realization hit her like a freight train crashing through her perfectly constructed reality. Stella was not a poor tailor. Stella was Estelle C. Stella owned the brand, she owned the gown, and now she owned Caroline's entire financial future. The thick cream-colored paper slipped from Caroline's trembling manicured fingers. It fluttered through the air and landed silently on the Persian rug. The blood completely drained from Caroline's face, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. Her knees buckled and she collapsed heavily against the side of the luggage stand, gasping for air. Madison jumped off the bed, her silk robe falling open. She rushed over and snatched the red invoice off the floor. She read the numbers. She read the name Stella at the bottom of the legal threat. The reality of their ruined empire finally penetrated her arrogant, narcissistic mind. Madison stared at the $185,000 demand, opened her mouth, and let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream that shattered the peaceful morning. I sat at the expansive marble island in my kitchen, the morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. The city below was waking up a sprawling grid of ambition and concrete, but up here everything was perfectly still. I poured myself a cup of freshly brewed espresso, the rich aroma filling the quiet space. Next to my coffee cup, my phone was vibrating with a violent, relentless energy. It danced across the polished stone surface, buzzing continuously like a trapped insect. I did not mute it. I simply watched the screen light up over and over again. The notifications cascaded down the digital display in a rapid, endless stream. Missed call from mother, missed call from father, missed call from Madison. Over and over the cycle repeated itself. By my count, the screen currently displayed exactly 66 missed calls. They had been trying to reach me for the past 45 minutes, undoubtedly right after the horrific realization set in at their luxury hotel suite. The sheer panic radiating from that vibrating piece of glass was intoxicating. For 33 years, they had ignored my calls, dismissed my needs, and treated my very existence as an annoying inconvenience. Now they were desperate for my attention. The phone lit up once more. Call number 67. It was Caroline. I took a slow sip of my espresso, letting the bitter, rich taste ground me. I reached out, swiped the green button, and placed the device on speakerphone. I did not even have the chance to offer a greeting before a shrill, hysterical shriek shattered the tranquility of my kitchen. "You are completely insane!" Caroline screamed into the receiver. Her voice was unrecognizable, stripped of all its usual pretentious country club refinement. It was raw, guttural, and absolutely terrified. "You psychotic, jealous little brat. I know exactly what you did. You hacked into the boutique system. You forged those Estelle C documents just to ruin your sister's perfect morning. I am calling the police right now. I am going to sue you for everything you have, and I will personally see to it that you rot in federal prison for fraud and identity theft." I let her scream. I let her exhaust her lungs, listening to the frantic gasps for air between her unhinged threats. In the background, I could hear Madisons sobbing loudly, a wet, ugly sound that indicated her pristine bridal makeup was entirely ruined. Caroline was grasping at the most illogical, desperate straws she could find. Her mind was utterly incapable of processing the truth. The idea that the daughter she had designated as the family failure was actually the mastermind behind a global luxury brand was completely short-circuiting her brain. She would rather believe I was a criminal hacker than admit I had outsmarted and outclassed her on every conceivable level. "Are you quite finished, Mother?" I asked, my voice echoing coldly in the spacious kitchen. I spoke with the precise, measured cadence of an executive dealing with a highly unreasonable client. There was no forgery, and there was absolutely no hacking involved. The invoice you are holding in your shaking hands is completely legitimate. The signature at the bottom of the financing agreement is your own. You eagerly signed that legal document on a digital tablet in my boutique, legally binding your home and your assets to my company. You did not read the fine print because you were too busy insulting my intelligence. "That is a lie!" Caroline shrieked, though her voice wavered with sudden terrifying doubt. "You are a seamstress. You fix zippers. You do not own a luxury couture house. You are making this up to extort us." "I am Estelle C." I stated, dropping the final undeniable hammer of truth. "I own the brand. I own the building you stood in. I designed the gown Madison is crying over right now, and I personally drafted the morality clause that you so arrogantly violated yesterday at the Waldorf Astoria. You explicitly called me a poor seamstress. You physically grabbed me and banned me from a venue because you were ashamed of my fabricated poverty. My private security team recorded the entire interaction, Mother. The audio file has already been submitted to my attorney, Dominic. The benefactor discount is permanently revoked. You owe my company $185,000. If you decide to involve the police, I will gladly hand them the binding contract you signed, proving that the only person going to jail for fraud and tax evasion will be you if you try to dodge this debt. I highly suggest you spend your energy finding a high-interest loan rather than screaming at me. Good luck securing those funds before Tuesday morning." There was a sharp scuffling sound on the other end of the line. The phone was being forcibly wrestled away. Suddenly, Harrison's voice boomed through the speaker. He was trying to project his usual domineering patriarchal authority, but the underlying tremor of absolute financial terror was impossible to hide. He knew the devastating reality of a property lien. He knew what would happen if Dominic filed that paperwork with the city. "Listen to me right now." Stella Harrison barked, his breathing heavy and erratic. "You are going to cancel this ridiculous invoice immediately. I do not care what kind of sick, twisted game you are playing with this boutique nonsense. You will not bankrupt this family over a petty grudge. If you do not drop this right now, I will destroy you. I will ruin your reputation. I will tell every single person in this city that you are a manipulative, greedy snake who tried to extort her own parents on her sister's wedding day. I will make sure you never work in this industry again. You are a disgrace to my name." I listened to the hollow, empty threats of a man who still believed he held any semblance of power over my life. He was a sinking ship trying to order the ocean to stop rising. His arrogance was almost pitiable in the face of his imminent financial destruction. You cannot destroy a reputation you do not have the clearance to even comprehend. Father, I replied, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. You have no power here. You are just a man about to lose his house because he could not stop his wife from running her mouth. Dominic has the paperwork drafted. The lien goes into effect the second that 48-hour window expires. You have exactly until Tuesday. I did not wait for his inevitable screaming response. I tapped the red button on the screen, cutting off his frantic voice mid-sentence. The absolute silence of my penthouse rushed back in soothing and victorious. I tapped the screen 3 more times, navigating to my contacts list. I selected Caroline's number, Harrison's number, and Madison's number. With a swift, decisive motion, I blocked all of them. They were completely cut off. The digital fortress was sealed, leaving them trapped in their hotel suite with nothing but a massive debt and their own impending ruin. Harrison and Caroline were not the type of people to accept defeat gracefully. In their narrow minds, they were the perpetual victims of a cruel world that simply failed to recognize their inherent superiority. Cut off from my phone, barred from negotiations, and facing a financial guillotine, they did exactly what desperate, arrogant people always do. They panicked, and then they doubled down on their own staggering stupidity. By Sunday afternoon, Harrison had frantically scoured the internet for legal representation. He could not afford a top-tier corporate litigator from Manhattan, not with his credit cards practically melting from the wedding expenses. Instead, he hired a discount strip mall attorney from the suburbs. This was a man who operated out of a tiny office next to a discount nail salon and specialized in minor traffic violations. This cheap lawyer, completely out of his depth in the realm of luxury retail contracts and high-stakes corporate law, eagerly took my father's last remaining cash retainer. He took one look at the Estelle C. invoice and assured my parents that it was nothing but an unenforceable intimidation tactic. He confidently promised Harrison that they could easily countersue my brand for emotional distress, harassment, and extortion. It was a spectacular, almost comical display of the blind leading the blind into absolute ruin. Armed with this disastrously inaccurate legal advice, Caroline decided to take her battle to the court of public opinion. If she could not reach me privately to scream at me, she would try to destroy me publicly. On Monday morning, she logged onto Facebook and crafted a masterful, entirely fabricated narrative designed to garner maximum sympathy from her country club friends and our extended relatives. I watched the drama unfold from the pristine silence of my penthouse office, sipping sparkling water, as my assistant forwarded me screenshots of the mounting online chaos. Caroline's post was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. She uploaded a beautifully edited, high-resolution photograph of Madison and Elijah at the altar, looking like a picture-perfect society couple. Beneath it, she wrote a sprawling multi-paragraph essay dripping with fake maternal heartbreak. She claimed that the happiest day of her life had been viciously sabotaged by her deeply troubled, jealous eldest daughter. Caroline painted a tragic, horrifying picture of me for her audience. She described me as an unstable, bitter spinster who had failed at every turn in life and harbored a toxic, obsessive envy toward Madison's incredible success. According to her unhinged post, I had completely lost my grip on reality, hacked into the billing system of a famous bridal boutique where I supposedly worked as a lowly assistant, and forged a massive fake invoice just to extort my own family on Madison's wedding day. She begged her friends for prayers, claiming that she was absolutely heartbroken by my greed and that the family was currently seeking a restraining order against my psychotic behavior. The internet responded exactly as Caroline had hoped. The post gained traction instantly within their superficial suburban social circles. Aunts, uncles, and family friends who had not spoken to me in a decade flooded the comment section with performative outrage. They praised Caroline's incredible strength as a mother. They offered their deepest sympathies to poor victimized Madison. They boldly called me a monster, a gold digger, and a total disgrace to the family name. My personal phone, though blocked from their direct numbers, began receiving hostile direct messages on various social media platforms from outraged cousins demanding that I apologize to my mother and immediately seek intensive psychiatric help. Madison even chimed in on the post, leaving a dramatic tear-jerking comment, thanking her mother for bravely protecting her from my toxic, jealous energy. They were feeding off the attention, basking in the warm glow of public martyrdom, absolutely convinced they had successfully spun the narrative and neutralized the threat. They thought they had won the public relations war. A younger, weaker version of me might have taken the bait. The old Stella would have frantically logged online, typing out paragraphs of desperate defense posting receipts and begging strangers to believe the truth. But I was not that scared girl anymore. I was a CEO. I understood that arguing with fools in a public forum only drags you down into their mud. Absolute icy silence is the most terrifying weapon you can wield against a narcissist who is desperately seeking a reaction. I did not leave a single comment. I did not post a single rebuttal. I did not block anyone. I simply took a certified digital archive of every single defamatory statement, every false accusation, and every public lie they had typed out for the world to see. I invited my private attorney Dominic to my penthouse that same afternoon. Dominic was a shark in a bespoke suit, a relentless corporate litigator who commanded $1,000 an hour and never lost a breach of contract case. He sat across from me at the marble dining table reviewing the cease and desist letter sent by my father's cheap suburban lawyer. Dominic actually let out a sharp, genuine laugh as he read the poorly drafted document. It was riddled with grammatical errors and cited completely irrelevant case law. Then I slid my tablet across the table showing him Caroline's viral Facebook post and the hundreds of defamatory comments beneath it. Dominic stopped laughing immediately. His eyes narrowed with predatory, calculated focus as he slowly scrolled through the digital evidence of their public smear campaign. He looked up at me, tapping his expensive silver pen against the polished stone table. "They just handed us a slam-dunk defamation case on a silver platter," he stated, his voice ringing with absolute lethal certainty. "Not only are they in undeniable breach of the morality clause, but they have now publicly committed libel against a globally recognized luxury brand. They are explicitly accusing Estelle C. of fraudulent billing practices, cybercrimes, and extortion in a highly public forum. The financial damages for brand defamation alone will bankrupt them twice over." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. "I do not want to play stupid games on the internet, Dominic," I said calmly, looking him dead in the eye. "I want to crush them in reality." Dominic nodded, his expression turning entirely ruthless. He opened his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of dense, intimidating legal documents. It was a meticulously crafted, devastatingly thorough lawsuit. It contained the original signed contract, the audio recordings of their verbal abuse outside the hotel, the financial lien execution orders, and now a massive, heavily documented edition for public defamation and commercial libel. Dominic aligned the thick stack of papers perfectly on the marble surface, squaring the edges with a sharp tap. "I will not send them another polite warning," Dominic promised, securing the files back into his briefcase with a definitive click. "I am bypassing their absolute joke of an attorney entirely. I am filing this massive binder directly with the state Supreme Court first thing tomorrow morning. The grace period is officially over, Stella. The trap is snapping shut." Tuesday morning arrived exactly as Dominic promised it would. The 48-hour grace period expired at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning. I was sitting in my penthouse reviewing fabric swatches for the upcoming season when Dominic sent a single satisfying text message. The motion was granted. The state court judge had taken one look at the impeccably drafted contract, the clear signature from Caroline, the audio recordings, and the undeniable breach of the morality clause. There was no hesitation. The judge signed the emergency property lien without a second thought. The legal machinery of the financial system moves with terrifying speed when guided by a lawyer of Dominic's caliber. Within an hour, electronic notices were dispatched to every major financial institution associated with my parents' social security numbers. The trap did not just snap shut, It locked them inside a financial vault and threw away the key. Their primary checking accounts, their emergency savings, their home equity lines, and every single high-limit credit card they possessed were instantly and mercilessly frozen. Miles away from my quiet sanctuary, Caroline and Harrison were completely oblivious to their impending doom. They were still riding the manufactured high of their viral social media posts and the lingering adrenaline of the wedding weekend. They firmly believed their discount suburban lawyer had magically protected them. To celebrate their supposed victory over their ungrateful daughter, they decided to host an impromptu, lavish post-wedding brunch for their country club friends. They drove their leased luxury vehicle to an incredibly exclusive high-end gourmet market, situated in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. It was the kind of establishment where truffles were kept under lock and key, and imported caviar was sold by the ounce to women carrying designer handbags. Caroline strutted through the pristine aisles with absolute arrogance. She filled her woven shopping basket with the most expensive items she could find. She grabbed artisan cheeses, imported cured meats, 3 bottles of vintage French champagne, and a massive tin of beluga caviar. Harrison followed close behind her, equally puffed up with false pride, loudly discussing how brilliant Madison looked on the dance floor and how thoroughly they had defeated my supposed extortion attempt. They were putting on a spectacular show of wealth and leisure for anyone who cared to listen. They finally approached the polished marble checkout counter. The cashier, a sharply dressed young man in a crisp apron, meticulously scanned their extravagant selection. The total came to an eye-watering sum of nearly $2,000 for a single grocery run. Caroline did not even blink. She offered a haughty, superior smile and pulled her shiny platinum credit card from her wallet. She handed it to the cashier with a theatrical flick of her wrist, expecting the usual seamless transaction that fueled her endless vanity. The cashier swiped the card through the terminal. The machine emitted a sharp, unpleasant beeping sound. The screen flashed a bright red error message. "I am sorry, madam," the cashier said politely, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "Your card has been declined." Caroline let out a loud, exaggerated scoff. She rolled her eyes, turning to look at the growing line of wealthy shoppers behind her, clearly playing the role of the inconvenienced elite. "Your machine must be malfunctioning," she declared sharply. "Run it again. That is a premium account with a massive limit. Run it manually if you have to." The cashier obliged, typing the numbers directly into the system. The machine beeped again, louder this time. The red error message returned, but this time it was accompanied by a specific, highly unusual banking code. The cashier frowned, looking at the screen, then looked back at Caroline with a distinct shift in his professional demeanor. "Madam, the system is not malfunctioning," he stated, his voice dropping an octave. "The bank has issued a hard decline. Furthermore, the authorization code explicitly instructs me to retain the card. Your financial institution has flagged this account." Caroline's face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson. "Do not be ridiculous!" she snapped, her voice rising in pitch and echoing across the quiet upscale market. "Give me my card back right now. You have absolutely no right to confiscate my property. Harrison, handle this incompetent boy." Harrison stepped forward, puffing out his chest to intimidate the young cashier. He pulled out his own heavy metal corporate credit card, slapping it down on the marble counter with aggressive force. "Use this one," Harrison barked. "And I expect an apology for embarrassing my wife in public. We spend thousands of dollars here every month." The cashier remained entirely unfazed by the hollow display of dominance. He picked up Harrison's metal card and swiped it through the terminal. The machine instantly rejected it. The exact same red error message appeared. The exact same confiscation code flashed on the screen. "Sir, this account has also been entirely frozen by your financial institution," the cashier announced, his voice carrying clearly to the people waiting in line. "I am required by store policy to retain this card as well. You will need to contact your bank immediately to resolve whatever severe hold they have placed on your assets. We cannot process your purchase today." The sheer, unadulterated humiliation hit Harrison and Caroline like a physical blow. The whispers began in the line behind them. Wealthy patrons were shifting uncomfortably, exchanging judgmental glances as they watched two people who projected absolute wealth suddenly get treated like common fraudsters. Harrison frantically pulled out his smartphone with trembling hands. He opened his primary banking application, his thumb slipping on the glass screen. The digital dashboard loaded, and the reality of their situation finally shattered their delusion. Every single account balance was displayed in stark red numbers. A massive glaring notification dominated the top of his screen, indicating a total asset freeze due to an active court-ordered property lien. The remaining available credit across all their accounts was exactly 0. Stella was not bluffing. Harrison whispered, his voice cracking with pure, unfiltered terror. His eyes darted wildly from the phone screen to Caroline's horrified face. She actually did it. She froze everything. "We have nothing." Caroline clutched the edge of the marble counter, her knees physically buckling under the weight of her sudden absolute financial ruin. The caviar and the vintage champagne sat in bags next to her, completely out of reach. The cheap lawyer had been completely wrong. They had lost the war before they even knew it started. As Harrison began to loudly argue with the cashier, desperately demanding his confiscated metal card back in a pathetic attempt to salvage his shredded dignity, a sleek, elegantly dressed figure paused at the end of the adjacent floral aisle. It was Josephine. She had been quietly browsing for fresh orchids for her dining room when the loud, crude commotion at the register caught her attention. She stood perfectly still, her designer handbag resting on her arm, watching the chaotic scene unfold. She saw Caroline weeping over a declined card. She saw Harrison shouting at a grocery clerk like a cornered animal. Josephine did not intervene. She did not rush forward to help her new extended family. Instead, she observed their humiliating financial failure with cold, calculating precision. Her sharp, aristocratic eyes narrowed slightly, and the very first lethal seeds of profound suspicion began to take root in her brilliant mind. Josephine turned her back on the pathetic spectacle unfolding at the checkout counter. She did not rush forward to offer her own platinum card to save her son's new in-laws from their very public humiliation. That was not how women of her stature operated. True wealth did not scream at grocery cashiers or sweat profusely over declined transactions. The sheer desperation in Harrison's voice and the absolute terror painting Caroline's face told Josephine everything she needed to know. They were completely broke. She walked out of the high-end gourmet market with her fresh orchids, her posture immaculate, while her highly analytical mind began to assemble the disturbing puzzle pieces she had gathered over the past few months. Madison had always tried just a fraction too hard. The constant name-dropping, the aggressive brandishing of designer logos, the desperate need to steer every single conversation toward the topic of money. It was the classic, undeniable behavior of an imposter clinging to the edge of a cliff. Josephine had initially dismissed it as youthful insecurity and an eagerness to impress her new husband. Now she saw it for what it truly was: a calculated, desperate deception. As soon as she settled into the plush leather seat of her chauffeured town car, Josephine retrieved her smartphone. She did not call Elijah. She called her primary wealth manager at her family trust headquarters in Atlanta. She requested a comprehensive, immediate financial background check on Harrison and his manufacturing company. In the world of high finance, privacy is an illusion if you know the exact right people to ask. Josephine had spent decades cultivating a ruthless network of banking executives, real estate developers, and corporate attorneys. Her wealth manager promised definitive results within the hour. By the time her car pulled into the private driveway of her temporary New York residence, the encrypted file had already arrived in her secure inbox. Josephine poured herself a glass of sparkling water, sat at her antique mahogany writing desk, and opened the digital dossier. The reality was far worse than a simple declined credit card at a supermarket. Harrison did not own a thriving empire. His business was heavily leveraged and actively bleeding capital. The family home, which Caroline had boasted about endlessly during the rehearsal dinner, was burdened by 2 separate mortgages. Their credit utilization was maxed out across the board. But the most alarming detail was a fresh, devastating update recorded just that very morning. A massive property lien had been officially executed against their primary residence by a highly formidable corporate litigation firm. The swiftness and brutality of the legal maneuver indicated that they had deeply crossed someone with immense power and limitless resources. They had offended a giant, and the giant had just stepped on them. Josephine needed to know exactly who had dropped the financial guillotine on her son's new in-laws. She instructed her driver to take her directly to the luxury hotel where Elijah and Madison were spending their first few days as a married couple before their scheduled honeymoon. When Josephine arrived at the suite, the atmosphere was thick with frantic, suppressed panic. Elijah was down in the hotel lobby taking a business call. Madison answered the heavy wooden door looking entirely unhinged. Her eyes were red and swollen and her hands shook violently as she tried to force a welcoming, radiant smile for her new mother-in-law. Josephine glided into the suite, her sharp gaze sweeping the chaotic, messy room. Madison babbled incoherently about a minor family emergency, excusing herself to the master bathroom to splash cold water on her face. Josephine remained in the sitting area, perfectly still, absorbing the frantic, terrifying energy of the space. That was when her eyes landed on the ornate bridal preservation box resting on a luggage rack in the corner of the room. The heavy satin ribbon had been hastily thrown on the floor. Next to the box, half shoved under a silver room service tray, was a crumpled piece of heavy cream-colored cardstock. Josephine's impeccable eye for luxury recognized the unparalleled quality of the paper immediately. She stepped closer and noticed the broken fragments of dark red wax clinging to the envelope. It was the unmistakable signature seal of Estelle C. Josephine knew that specific wax seal intimately. She had commissioned 3 custom evening gowns from the brand over the past 5 years for various high-society philanthropic galas. She reached out and smoothly pulled the crumpled document from beneath the silver tray. She unfolded the crisp pages and began to read. Her sharp mind processed the dense legal terminology with ruthless efficiency. It was a notice of immediate breach of contract and the revocation of a benefactor discount. She read the horrifying total of $185,000. She read the specific trigger for the financial penalty. The guarantor had engaged in explicit verbal disparagement and abusive behavior toward the primary payer and owner of the brand, a woman named Stella. The name echoed in Josephine's mind like a perfectly struck tuning fork. Stella. The older sister who had been forced to clear dirty plates at the bridal shower. The quiet, dignified woman who had been banished to the kitchen doors at the wedding reception. The woman Caroline had loudly mocked as a delusional, impoverished seamstress. Josephine closed her eyes, recalling the brilliant, masterful sketch she had seen fall from Stella's pocket just a few days ago. The structural genius of that drawing suddenly made absolute, undeniable sense. Stella was not a struggling tailor. Stella was Estelle C. The quiet, discarded sister was the creative genius and billionaire owner of the most exclusive bridal couture house in the nation. Madison and Caroline had literally bitten the hand that fed them, insulting a fashion titan while wearing her heavily subsidized creations. Josephine felt a surge of pure, icy fury toward her new daughter-in-law. Madison had lied to Elijah about her family's wealth, and she had actively participated in the grotesque abuse of an artistic visionary. Josephine folded the invoice with sharp, precise movements and slipped it neatly into her designer handbag. She did not wait for Madison to emerge from the bathroom. She walked straight out of the hotel suite and pulled out her phone. She bypassed her standard contact list and opened an exclusive encrypted digital address book reserved only for her highest-tier connections. She selected the private direct concierge number for the owner of Estelle C. It was time to bypass the garbage and speak directly to the Queen. The heavy brass-trimmed doors of the Century Club closed silently behind me, instantly sealing off the chaotic noise of Manhattan traffic. I wore a tailored double-breasted ivory pantsuit that projected absolute, undeniable authority. My executive assistant had received a direct, highly urgent request from Josephine earlier that very afternoon. The matriarch had entirely bypassed standard customer service channels, utilizing a private encrypted concierge line reserved exclusively for my highest tier clients. I had instructed my legal team to stand down for the afternoon and accepted the meeting. It was time for the two queens of this chessboard to finally sit at the same table. I walked across the plush, deep red carpets of the private members' lounge, my heels clicking with a deliberate, unhurried rhythm. Josephine was already seated at a secluded corner table flanked by tall leather wingback chairs and heavy velvet drapes that provided maximum privacy. A silver pot of rare Darjeeling tea rested between us, steam rising elegantly into the dim light. As I approached, Josephine looked up from her china teacup. I watched the physical shock ripple through her otherwise impeccable posture. The woman sitting across from her was not the meek invisible sister hidden away by the catering doors at the rehearsal dinner. I was not the poor discarded seamstress banned from entering the Waldorf Astoria to protect a fragile suburban ego. I was Estelle C., the creative visionary and sole proprietor of a global couture empire that catered to the top 1% of the world. "Please take a seat," Stella Josephine commanded softly. Her voice was steady, but her sharp, highly analytical eyes assessed every single inch of my demeanor. She was mentally processing the seismic shift in my presence. She reached into her designer handbag and placed a crumpled red wax-sealed envelope on the polished wooden table between us. I found this rather illuminating document hidden beneath a room service tray in my son's hotel suite this morning. "I must admit, I possess a rare talent for reading people, but your family managed to execute a deception so layered, it briefly obscured my vision. I assumed you were merely a quiet sibling enduring a difficult, toxic family dynamic. It appears I was looking at a financial titan masquerading as a servant." I took my seat, folding my hands neatly on the table, meeting her intense gaze without a flinch. "I never intended to deceive you, Josephine. I simply allowed my mother and sister to project their own profound insecurities onto me. They needed a convenient scapegoat to elevate their fabricated status in your eyes. I gave them enough rope and they enthusiastically hung themselves." I reached into my designer leather briefcase and withdrew a sleek black legal folder. I placed it directly next to her crumpled envelope. "You discovered the financial invoice?" I continued, my tone entirely clinical and detached. "But you need the complete context to understand exactly what kind of people your son just married into." I opened the folder. First, I slid the signed guarantor contract across the table. It featured Caroline's frantic signature, legally binding her to my company. Next, I placed the court-ordered property lien documents stamped and certified by the state Supreme Court. This proves that their supposed generational wealth is nothing more than a heavily mortgaged house of cards. They are currently facing imminent foreclosure. Finally, I placed a small encrypted digital audio player on the table. I pressed a single button. The crystal-clear recording filled the quiet corner of the private club. Caroline's voice echoed sharply, calling me a useless embarrassment, demanding I illegally drain my retirement accounts to pay for their imported wedding flowers because their credit cards were maxed out. Then the audio shifted to the bridal shower. Madison's cruel, mocking tone filled the air as she publicly stripped me of my bridesmaid duties because I allegedly could not afford a dress worthy of your family. The final recording was the altercation outside the hotel, where Caroline physically grabbed my arm, declaring that a poor tailor would ruin their illusion of wealth in front of the elite in-laws. I stopped the playback. The silence that followed was heavier than lead. Josephine stared at the digital player, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly, her knuckles turned completely white. Her chest rose and fell with slow, deeply controlled breaths. The initial shock that had widened her eyes was entirely gone. In its place was a dark, terrifying, and absolute fury. The matriarch of the Atlanta elite was connecting every single dot. She remembered Madison bragging about non-existent real estate investments. She remembered Caroline desperately trying to mimic the refined behaviors of old money while lacking any basic human decency. She looked down at the legal documents proving they were on the brink of total financial collapse. But the money was not what ignited Josephine's righteous wrath. It was the recordings. It was the undeniable proof of their grotesque abusive treatment of their own blood. Josephine realized in that very second that her brilliant, successful son Elijah had not just married a financial fraud, he had legally bound himself to a family that was completely, irreparably rotten to its moral core. Josephine did not waste a single second after our meeting at the private club concluded. She stood up from the polished wooden table, her posture radiating a lethal, uncompromising elegance, and immediately dialed her son. She bypassed the usual pleasantries entirely, her voice sharp and commanding. She instructed Elijah to bring his new bride and her parents to her private Upper East Side townhouse immediately. She framed the demand simply as an urgent mandatory family summit to discuss a pressing financial matter that required their absolute and undivided attention. When Elijah relayed this cryptic message to Madison in their chaotic hotel suite, the reaction from my parents was nothing short of a psychological marvel. Instead of feeling the impending, crushing dread of discovery, Caroline and Harrison actually celebrated. Their monumental arrogance and lifelong habit of absolute delusion completely blinded them to reality. They firmly convinced themselves that Josephine had simply caught wind of their frozen credit cards at the gourmet market through her vast network of banking contacts and was stepping in to graciously rescue them. In their twisted narcissistic minds, wealthy families always bailed each other out of minor administrative banking glitches to preserve the collective social image. Harrison loudly and proudly declared that Josephine was probably eager to inject a massive amount of capital into his failing business ventures to solidify their newly merged family dynasties. Caroline immediately dried her frantic tears of panic from earlier that morning, completely pushing the catastrophic red invoice from my boutique out of her mind. She genuinely believed that the matriarch of an Atlanta financial empire was about to hand them a blank check and welcome them into the highest echelons of society. The sheer audacity of their delusion dictated their incredibly foolish next moves. Despite being entirely bankrupt and facing an imminent property lien that would strip them of their home, Caroline and Harrison spent 2 full hours getting ready for the summons, as if they were attending a royal coronation. They frantically dug through their luxury luggage to find the most ostentatious label, heavy outfits they could possibly muster. Caroline draped herself in an oversized, highly recognizable cashmere shawl and secured a heavy layered pearl necklace around her throat, desperately trying to project an aura of generational wealth that she did not actually possess. Harrison aggressively polished his expensive loafers and adjusted his silk tie standing in front of the suite mirror to practice his fake confident business pitch. Madison enthusiastically reapplied her pristine bridal makeup, buzzing with the arrogant thrill of being the cherished, newly minted daughter-in-law of a billionaire. They piled into a hired black luxury car, likely burning through the very last desperate drops of a hidden debit card just to pay for the extravagant ride across the city. During the short trip through Manhattan, the cabin of the vehicle was filled with their sickening, triumphant chatter. Caroline loudly reassured Madison that this meeting was the absolute ultimate proof of their societal success. She claimed that Josephine clearly recognized their innate value and was stepping up to protect them from my supposed cyberbullying and extortion. Harrison chuckled smugly, boasting about how he planned to casually accept Josephine's money while offering her a purely symbolic stake in his sinking company. They actually laughed at my expense, mocking my pathetic attempt to ruin their perfect wedding weekend with a fake invoice. They rode the elevator up to Josephine's sprawling residence wrapped in an impenetrable soundproof bubble of absolute denial. Elijah remained quiet during the ride, his sharp, analytical mind sensing a profound, unsettling disturbance in his mother's sudden demand. He knew Josephine better than anyone else in the world. His mother did not arrange emergency summits to hand out casual financial favors or stroke the egos of newly acquired in-laws. She only summoned people to her private sanctuary when a severe reckoning was required. Still maintaining his composed exterior, he politely escorted his new wife and her boastful parents through the heavy oak double doors of the private townhouse. A uniformed butler greeted the group in the grand foyer, his face a masterful mask of strict professional indifference. The foyer itself was a breathtaking masterpiece of architectural intimidation. It featured sweeping marble staircases, soaring ceilings, and imported antique tapestries that instantly made Caroline's flashy cashmere shawl look incredibly cheap and try hard by comparison. The butler silently guided the group down a long, dimly lit corridor, adorned with original oil paintings, leading them directly toward the primary drawing room. Caroline walked with her head held unnaturally high, a wide, greedy smile plastered across her meticulously contoured face. Harrison puffed out his chest completely, ready to play the role of the slightly inconvenienced but deeply grateful patriarch, accepting a financial bailout. Madison clung tightly to Elijah's arm, practically vibrating with the intense anticipation of receiving a massive financial gift to kickstart her wealthy new marriage. They felt completely invincible, utterly convinced that their fraudulent performance had successfully fooled one of the most powerful women in the country. The heavy mahogany doors to the drawing room swung open smoothly. The massive space was flooded with warm golden afternoon light pouring in through towering arched windows. Caroline and Madison stepped over the threshold first, their faces stretched into perfectly practiced, radiant smiles of overwhelming gratitude. They were entirely ready to graciously accept whatever massive bailout the billionaire matriarch was about to offer them. But those grand, hollow smiles instantly froze on their faces, locking into rigid expressions of pure, unadulterated horror. The blood completely drained from Caroline's cheeks in a matter of milliseconds, leaving her looking physically ill and older than she had ever appeared. Madison stopped dead in her tracks, her manicured fingers digging so painfully into Elijah's arm that he physically flinched. The scene before them violently and irrevocably shattered their entire manufactured reality. Josephine was not sitting at an ornate desk preparing a generous life-saving check for them. She was seated comfortably on a deeply tufted leather sofa, projecting an aura of lethal quiet dominance. And sitting directly across from her, holding a delicate fine china teacup with absolute unbothered serenity, was me. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the imported English Earl Grey tea, the fabric of my tailored ivory pantsuit catching the bright sunlight. I gently placed the teacup back onto its matching saucer, letting the sharp clink echo through the deadly, suffocating silence of the grand room. I looked up slowly, meeting my mother's horrified gaze, and offered her and my sister a cold, terrifying smile as their entire fake world finally collapsed around them. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind them, sealing the grand drawing room like an inescapable vault. Caroline stood absolutely frozen on the intricate Persian rug. The oversized cashmere shawl she had draped so carefully over her shoulders suddenly looked like a cheap, suffocating restraint. Harrison stopped mid-stride, his fake, highly rehearsed business smile shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Madison let out a sharp, strangled gasp, her manicured hands flying to cover her mouth as she stumbled backward. I remained perfectly seated next to Josephine on the tufted leather sofa, my posture relaxed and commanding. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my imported Earl Grey tea. The delicate porcelain cup met the matching saucer, with a sharp, crisp clink that echoed like a judge striking a gavel in the dead silent room. "Take a seat," Josephine commanded. It was not a polite request. It was an executioner's direct order. Her voice carried the cold, undisputed weight of generational wealth and absolute terrifying authority. Harrison and Caroline stumbled toward the velvet sofa positioned opposite us, their legs visibly shaking, barely supporting their own weight. Madison sank heavily into an armchair next to Elijah, her terrified eyes darting frantically between my calm face and her new formidable mother-in-law. Elijah remained standing directly behind his wife, his sharp, analytical eyes intensely assessing the bizarre, highly charged dynamic unfolding before him. He was a ruthless, highly trained investment banker. He could smell a catastrophic financial failure long before the market even registered the crash. Josephine did not waste a single breath on meaningless pleasantries. She reached onto the center of the antique glass coffee table and picked up the thick black legal folder I had provided during our private meeting. With a swift, powerful, and utterly dismissive motion, she tossed the heavy stack of documents directly onto the space between us. The papers fanned out across the polished wood, brutally exposing their darkest, most fiercely guarded secrets to the bright afternoon sunlight. There were the certified bank statements showing their severely overdrawn accounts. There was the emergency property lien mandated by the state Supreme Court, highlighted in glaring yellow ink. And resting right on top of the pile was the signed Estelle C. financing agreement, complete with the bright red, devastating invoice demanding exactly $185,000. Caroline stared down at the documents as if they were venomous snakes ready to strike. Her chest heaved with sudden, erratic, and terrified breaths. She looked up at Josephine, her heavily powdered face turning entirely pale and slick with a cold, nervous sweat. "Josephine, you must understand." Caroline stammered, her voice high-pitched and vibrating with desperate, unhinged panic. "This is a massive, terrible misunderstanding. That girl sitting next to you is my deeply disturbed daughter. She is a low-level tailor who has harbored a sick, obsessive jealousy toward Madison for years. She fabricated all of these documents. She forged my signature to extort us. She is a criminal, a completely insane woman trying to ruin this beautiful family union because she has nothing going for her in life." Harrison vigorously nodded along thick drops of sweat beading on his forehead. "It is true, Josephine," he insisted, puffing out his chest in a final pathetic attempt to project his fading masculine authority. "Stella has always been unstable and vindictive. She clearly hacked into a luxury boutique's billing system just to embarrass us in front of you. I am already in contact with my high-powered legal team to have her arrested for cybercrimes. We are incredibly wealthy, secure people. You know us. You saw our rehearsal dinner. We would never default on a floral bill, let alone an actual luxury bridal gown. This is just a poor, jealous woman trying to tear down her superiors." Josephine slowly picked up her silver-topped walking cane, an antique piece she rarely used for mobility, but frequently carried for sheer intimidating presence. She slammed the heavy metal tip down hard against the marble floor. The sharp cracking sound instantly sliced through the air, completely silencing Harrison's pathetic, frantic rambling. "You are a pack of absolute insufferable fools," Josephine stated, her voice dropping into a lethal quiet register that demanded total, unquestioning submission. "You sit in my private home dripping in cheap, maxed-out credit card debt, and you dare to lie directly to my face. You are actively trampling on your only benefactor." "The woman sitting next to me is not a low-level tailor. She is Estelle C. She is the sole creator, visionary, and undisputed owner of the global brand your daughter is currently wearing. She is a design titan whom the highest tiers of our elite society practically beg to dress them. And you, Caroline, had the sheer audacity to treat her like a peasant." Josephine leaned forward, her dark eyes blazing with an icy, aristocratic fury that stripped the flesh from their bones. "I have personally listened to the audio recordings of you verbally abusing this brilliant woman outside my son's wedding. I have seen the certified financial records proving you are completely bankrupt and facing imminent foreclosure this very week. You lied to my son about your status. You abused your own flesh and blood to fund a fraudulent, highly pathetic lifestyle. Stella built an international empire from nothing, while you are nothing but a group of hollow, vapid parasites, desperately clinging to a life you cannot afford." Elijah had remained perfectly silent throughout the entire devastating exchange. As a top-tier investment banker, he was professionally trained to separate human emotion from hard, undeniable data. He slowly reached past his trembling, weeping wife and picked up the scattered financial dossiers from the coffee table. He flipped through the crisp pages, his expert eyes rapidly scanning the disastrous debt ratios, the massive second mortgages, and the undeniable court-ordered property lien. He read the strict morality clause embedded in the bridal contract, noting Caroline's fully verified digital signature at the bottom. The meticulously constructed, glamorous illusion of his new in-laws evaporated into thin air instantly. Elijah slowly lowered the thick stack of documents. He turned his head slightly and looked down at Madison. The newly minted bride stared back up at him, fresh, terrified tears ruining her expensive makeup, her mouth trembling as she tried to formulate another useless, transparent lie. Elijah did not scream. He did not yell. He simply stared at the woman he had married just 48 hours ago, his eyes filled with a dark, absolute, and overwhelming disgust. Elijah tossed the heavy stack of financial dossiers back onto the antique glass coffee table. The loud thud made Madison physically jump. She looked up at her new husband, her chest heaving with panicked breaths, thick tears streaming down her carefully contoured face and completely ruining her expensive bridal makeup. She reached out with a trembling manicured hand, desperately trying to grab the sleeve of his tailored suit jacket to anchor herself. Elijah took a sharp, deliberate step backward. The physical distance he placed between them was vast, instantly turning the space in the drawing room into an impassable chasm of rejection. "You sat in my penthouse in Atlanta 6 months ago and looked me dead in the eye," Elijah began. His voice was not raised. It was entirely stripped of emotion, radiating the terrifying clinical detachment of a senior investment banker assessing a catastrophic corporate failure. "You explicitly bragged about your family's extensive real estate portfolio. You claimed your parents owned multiple highly profitable commercial properties across the state and a luxurious vacation home in the Hamptons. You spun an elaborate, highly detailed narrative about generational wealth, conservative investment strategies, and how your father was a titan of manufacturing who commanded ultimate respect in the business world." Madison choked on a loud sob, her hands fluttering helplessly in the air as she tried to catch her breath. "Elijah, please, I can explain everything to you right now. It is not what it looks like at all. My father just hit a minor rough patch with the global supply chain. We are simply liquidating some temporary assets to restructure the company. It is just a minor cash flow issue. We are still a very wealthy family." "Do not insult my intelligence," Madison Elijah interrupted, his tone slicing through her pathetic lies like a surgical scalpel. "I spend my entire life analyzing complicated balance sheets for multinational corporations. I know exactly what a sinking ship looks like the second I glance at the numbers. Your parents do not own a real estate portfolio. They own a massive pile of heavily leveraged toxic liabilities. This primary residence you constantly boasted about is saddled with 2 separate mortgages that are currently in severe default. They have zero equity to their name. Their credit utilization is entirely maxed out across 14 different high-interest accounts. And now they have a state-mandated property lien, crushing whatever microscopic fraction of net worth they had left because they refused to pay a dressmaker. You are not a wealthy heiress, experiencing a temporary cash flow issue. You are completely, undeniably bankrupt." Caroline tried to stand up from the velvet sofa, to defend her daughter, her face a mask of panicked indignation and wounded pride. "Now listen here, Elijah. You have absolutely no right to speak to my daughter this way. We are a highly respectable family in our community. We just hosted a magnificent, flawless wedding for you two at the Waldorf Astoria. You hosted a wedding using stolen funds, unpaid invoices, and fraudulent promises," Elijah snapped, turning his lethal gaze toward Caroline and shutting her down instantly. "You swiped credit cards you knew you could not afford to pay back, and you viciously abused your own eldest daughter to subsidize your fake glamorous lifestyle. You disgust me on a fundamental level." He turned his attention back to Madison, who was now weeping hysterically into her hands. The pristine, untouchable image she had so carefully constructed over the past year was melting away rapidly, revealing the terrified, shallow fraud hiding underneath the designer clothes. "I married you because you presented yourself as a woman of substance," Elijah stated, his voice ringing with absolute, crushing finality. "I thought you had education, refinement, and class. I believed you were a partner who understood the immense responsibilities of managing significant wealth and upholding a prestigious family name. But you and your parents are nothing but leeches. You are empty, shallow parasites who lied your way into my life solely to siphon off our resources and save yourselves from your own grotesque financial incompetence." Madison wailed loudly, dropping to her knees on the intricate Persian rug. She grabbed Elijah's pant leg, begging him to forgive her, swearing that she truly loved him and that the money meant absolutely nothing to her. She cried that she was just intimidated by his mother and wanted to prove she was worthy of the powerful dynasty. Elijah did not bend an inch. He stared down at his weeping bride with eyes as cold and unforgiving as winter ice. He gently but firmly pried her desperate fingers off his clothing and stepped away, leaving her kneeling on the floor. Josephine observed the entire destruction of her new daughter-in-law with a profound aristocratic stillness. She had allowed her son to deliver the necessary brutal reality check. Now it was time for the matriarch to finalize the absolute terms of surrender. She raised her hand gracefully, signaling to the shadows near the grand entryway. A tall, sharply dressed man stepped forward into the golden afternoon sunlight. It was Lawrence, the chief legal counsel for Josephine's family trust. He had been waiting silently in the corridor, completely prepared for this exact moment. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and wore an expression of absolute professional indifference. Lawrence walked directly to the coffee table and extracted a thick, legally binding document bound in dark blue casing. He placed it precisely in front of Madison, alongside a heavy silver luxury pen. Madison stopped sobbing just long enough to stare at the dense legal packet. Her tear-filled eyes darted from the document to Josephine, wide with renewed, suffocating terror. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice cracking violently in her dry throat. "This is your new reality," Madison Josephine declared smoothly, leaning back against the tufted leather sofa. "You entered this marriage under deeply fraudulent pretenses. You lied about your financial standing, and you proved yourself to be morally bankrupt by abusing the very woman who clothed you. Therefore, the standard prenuptial agreement you signed is no longer sufficient to protect my son's vast assets from your incredibly toxic, desperate family." Josephine gestured elegantly toward the paperwork. "That is a comprehensive post-nuptial agreement drafted by my legal team within the last 3 hours. It contains highly specific, unalterable stipulations. You are hereby stripped of all joint financial rights. You will have absolutely no access to Elijah's investment accounts, trust funds, or real estate holdings. You will receive a strictly monitored, modest monthly allowance for basic living expenses entirely controlled by my financial officers. In the event of a divorce, which Elijah has every legal right to initiate immediately based on your documented financial fraud, you will receive 0 alimony, 0 settlement payouts, and you will walk away with exactly what you brought into this marriage, which is absolutely nothing." Caroline let out a horrified gasp from the sofa, realizing her ultimate meal ticket had just been incinerated right before her eyes. "Madison, do not sign that document. It is a massive trap. They are trying to leave you completely destitute." Josephine smiled a cold, terrifying expression that instantly froze the blood in Caroline's veins. "She is already destitute, Caroline. I am simply making it permanent." Josephine looked back down at her weeping daughter-in-law. "You have exactly 2 choices right now, Madison. You can refuse to sign that contract, and Elijah will file for an immediate annulment based on extreme fraud, leaving you to move back into the foreclosed, heavily indebted home of your parents with a ruined reputation. Or you can sign the postnuptial agreement right now, accept your new highly restricted place in this family, and spend the rest of your miserable marriage proving you are not the pathetic, deceitful parasite you appear to be. The choice is entirely yours." Madison stared at the heavy silver pen. She looked at her parents, who were shivering with fear on the sofa, offering absolutely no salvation or financial rescue. She looked at Elijah, who stood with his arms crossed, his face an impenetrable wall of pure disgust. She had completely lost the game. Her grand, arrogant illusion had shattered into dust. With a loud, agonizing sob that tore from the depths of her throat, Madison slowly reached out with a trembling hand. She picked up the silver pen and began to sign her entire life away. When the final signature was placed on the heavy paper, her body simply gave out. She collapsed entirely onto the hardwood floor, curling into a tight, miserable ball, weeping uncontrollably, as the crushing weight of her absolute ruin finally settled over her shoulders. I sat quietly next to Josephine, taking one final victorious sip of my tea, watching the golden child finally get exactly what she deserved. The swift and brutal reality of the American legal system does not care about suburban social status or fabricated country club reputations. 2 weeks after the disastrous summit at Josephine's townhouse, the civil lawsuit regarding the breached contract and public defamation officially commenced in state court. Harrison and Caroline walked into the polished mahogany courtroom looking like entirely different people. The arrogant, boastful parents who had loudly paraded through the Waldorf Astoria were completely gone. In their place sat two hollow, terrified individuals, weighed down by the crushing gravity of their imminent financial destruction. They were represented by the same discount suburban attorney they had desperately hired weeks ago, a man who looked physically ill as he took his seat opposing my legal counsel. Dominic did not just win the case, he executed a flawless, merciless legal slaughter. He methodically presented the signed guarantor contract, the audio recordings of their verbal abuse, and the certified digital archives of Caroline's defamatory social media posts. He laid out the exact financial damages their lies had caused my luxury brand. The defense attempted a pathetic, scrambling argument, claiming Caroline was under emotional duress and did not understand the fine print of the custom bridal gown contract. The presiding judge, a no-nonsense woman with zero tolerance for frivolous defenses, shut them down immediately. She explicitly stated that adults who willfully sign financial guarantees for six-figure luxury goods cannot claim ignorance when the bill comes due, especially when they simultaneously engage in documented public libel. The final ruling was swift, definitive, and absolutely devastating. The judge ordered Harrison and Caroline to pay the full $185,000 balance for the breached contract and the revoked benefactor discount. Furthermore, recognizing the malicious intent behind their public smear campaign, the judge awarded an additional $50,000 to cover my legal fees and compensate for defamation of character. The grand total was a staggering $235,000 payable immediately. Harrison sat frozen at the defense table, the blood entirely draining from his face as the gavel struck the sounding block. He did not have $200,000. He did not even have $2,000 in liquid cash. His business accounts were seized, his credit lines were frozen, and his remaining assets were drowning in toxic leverage. The court-ordered property lien that Dominic had filed weeks earlier was instantly activated and converted into a writ of execution. The bank, sensing the catastrophic default, moved in with predatory speed. The foreclosure process was not quiet, and it was certainly not private. It was a spectacular, highly visible public execution of their carefully curated suburban illusion. Less than a month after the court ruling, a county sheriff vehicle pulled directly into the manicured driveway of my parents' sprawling colonial home. Uniformed officers stepped out and taped a bright, glaring neon yellow eviction and foreclosure notice straight onto the heavy oak front door. The very house they had proudly boasted about to Elijah's family, the pristine fortress where they had spent 33 years, making me feel completely worthless, was officially seized by the bank to satisfy their massive, insurmountable debts. Because they lacked the funds to even rent a moving truck or secure a storage unit, the bank ordered an immediate estate liquidation to recoup the remaining capital. A fleet of estate liquidators and auctioneers descended upon the property. They ruthlessly marched through the house, slapping neon price tags on every single item Caroline held dear. Her imported crystal vases, the antique dining table where they had gleefully plotted my financial ruin, Harrison's golf clubs, and even the expensive patio furniture were dragged out onto the front lawn to be auctioned off for pennies on the dollar. The social fallout was absolute and terminal. The very same country club friends and gossiping neighbors that Caroline had spent decades desperately trying to impress now gathered on the sidewalks just to watch the spectacle. Women who used to drink mimosas with my mother stood at the edge of the property line, whispering behind their hands and pointing at the clearance tags slapped across her designer handbags. They watched with barely concealed mockery as the illusion of the wealthy, successful family was dismantled piece by piece and sold to bargain hunters. Caroline tried to hide inside the empty, echoing living room, weeping hysterically as strangers tracked dirt across her expensive hardwood floors, carrying away the last physical remnants of her shattered pride. Their reputation in the community was completely incinerated. They were no longer the elite, successful parents of a billionaire dynasty. They were the local frauds who had gone bankrupt trying to cheat a luxury designer who turned out to be their own discarded daughter. With their home repossessed, their bank accounts emptied, and their social standing utterly destroyed, Harrison and Caroline were violently pushed into a corner with absolutely no remaining exits. They had nowhere to go. Their golden child Madison was trapped under a suffocating postnuptial agreement stripped of all financial power and strictly forbidden by Josephine and Elijah from funneling a single cent to her toxic parents. They were completely terrifyingly alone. Desperation breeds a very specific kind of humiliation. Stripped of their arrogance and their home, they loaded the last of their meager belongings into a cheap rented economy car. They did not drive to a motel. They drove straight into the heart of Manhattan. They pulled up to the towering, gleaming glass skyscraper that housed the global corporate headquarters of Estelle C. The afternoon sun reflected blindingly off the corporate tower as Harrison and Caroline stumbled out of their rented vehicle. They bypassed the pristine revolving doors and approached the imposing suited security guards stationed outside the grand entrance. They looked disheveled, exhausted, and entirely broken. As the guards stepped forward to block their path, Harrison and Caroline did something I never ever thought I would witness in my entire lifetime. Right there on the cold, unforgiving concrete of Fifth Avenue, surrounded by rushing pedestrians and powerful corporate executives, my parents physically collapsed. They dropped heavily to their knees on the pavement, completely abandoning the last shreds of their dignity. Caroline began to sob uncontrollably, her hands clutching the fabric of her cheap coat, while Harrison bowed his head loudly and frantically, begging the security guards to please let them upstairs to see the daughter they had once thrown away, desperately pleading for a single ounce of the mercy they had never shown me. I was standing in my corner office on the 60th floor when my head of security buzzed the private intercom. He informed me that two individuals matching the descriptions of my parents were currently causing a massive disturbance on the sidewalk directly outside the main corporate entrance. They were physically obstructing the pedestrian walkway, weeping uncontrollably, and demanding an immediate audience with the chief executive officer. My assistant asked if she should authorize the guards to contact the local precinct and have them forcibly removed for trespassing and public nuisance. I looked out through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, watching the tiny yellow taxis navigate the concrete canyons of Manhattan far below. I took a slow, deep breath. I told her no. I told her to have the security detail hold their position. I was going to handle this final transaction myself. I stepped into my private express elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor lobby. The descent was smooth and entirely silent, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos waiting for me at the street level. I was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal gray designer suit that projected an impenetrable armor of corporate dominance. My posture was perfectly straight. My mind was entirely clear. There was no anxiety left in my chest. The terrified, desperate young woman who had once craved their validation had been completely eradicated. In her place stood a billionaire who had just legally and financially dismantled the very people who tried to destroy her. When the polished silver doors of the elevator slid open into the grand marble lobby, my personal security team immediately flanked me. Two highly trained, broad-shouldered men in dark suits stepped forward, forming a protective barrier as I walked toward the towering glass revolving doors. The afternoon sunlight poured into the lobby, illuminating the pathetic, grotesque spectacle unfolding on the concrete pavement outside. I pushed through the glass doors and stepped out onto the bustling Fifth Avenue sidewalk. The cold autumn wind whipped around us, but I did not shiver. The moment my mother laid eyes on me, she let out a loud, agonizing wail. Caroline was still kneeling on the dirty pavement, her previously flawless, highlighted hair now a tangled, disheveled mess. The expensive coat she was wearing looked incredibly absurd against her current state of absolute ruin. Her face was slick with tears and smeared mascara, entirely stripped of the arrogant country club superiority she had worn like a crown for her entire life. Harrison was kneeling right beside her. The man who had spent 33 years belittling my ambitions, calling my career a miserable failure and threatening to drag me out of my sister's wedding by my hair, was now groveling at my leather-clad feet. His face was gray and sunken. He looked up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes completely shattered by the absolute reality of his bankruptcy and public humiliation. Stella Harrison choked out, his voice cracking violently as he reached a trembling hand out toward the hem of my trousers. My security guards instantly stepped forward, blocking his hand with swift, aggressive precision. Harrison recoiled, clutching his chest. "Stella, please, you have to stop this. You have to call off the bank. They took the house. They took the cars. We have absolutely nothing left. We are sleeping in a rented economy car. You cannot do this to us." Caroline began to sob harder, her chest heaving as she gazed up at me with pathetic, desperate eyes. "We are so sorry, Stella. We were completely wrong about everything. We will do whatever you want. We will publicly apologize to your brand. Just please give us a loan. Just enough to get a small apartment. You have millions of dollars. You own this entire building. This amount of money is absolutely nothing to you, but it is everything to us. Please have some mercy on your own mother." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the two miserable people kneeling on the cold concrete. A crowd of wealthy Manhattan professionals and curious tourists had begun to gather at a safe distance, their smartphones out, recording the magnificent downfall of two arrogant narcissists. I felt no pity. I felt no lingering biological obligation. I simply felt the cold, hard satisfaction of ultimate justice. I do not negotiate with people who extort my business. I stated, my voice echoing with a glacial, unyielding authority that cut through the noise of the city traffic. Harrison shook his head frantically, fresh tears spilling over his cheeks. He tried to deploy the very last manipulative weapon he had in his arsenal. "Stella, listen to yourself. We are your family. We are your blood. You cannot push your own parents out onto the street to freeze. No matter what happened between us, blood is thicker than water. You cannot just abandon us when we are at our lowest possible point." I stared directly into his terrified eyes, letting a cold, terrifying smile touch the corners of my mouth. Blood does not kick their eldest daughter out the door because they are afraid her presence will make them lose face in front of rich strangers, I said, my voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register that forced them to listen to every single syllable. Blood does not call their own child a parasitic, useless failure. Blood does not try to drain my life savings to buy imported flowers for a sister who treats me like human garbage. You made it abundantly clear that I was never your family. I was just an inconvenient prop in your fake, glamorous suburban stage play. Caroline let out a devastated gasp, burying her face in her hands as the absolute, irreversible truth of my words struck her. "You spent my entire life teaching me a brutal lesson about reality." I continued, my tone entirely devoid of any mercy. "You taught me that compassion is a weakness, that status is everything, and that failure will be punished without any hesitation. You demanded that I face the harsh realities of the world all by myself. Well, mother, father, I learned your lesson perfectly, and now you get to experience the exact same reality you forced upon me. I highly suggest you enjoy it." I did not wait for their response. I did not need to hear another pathetic, hollow apology. I turned my back on them with absolute, permanent finality. I signaled to my security detail, and we marched seamlessly back through the towering glass doors of the corporate headquarters. Behind me, the desperate, unhinged screaming escalated. Caroline was shrieking my name, her voice tearing through her raw throat, begging me to come back. Harrison was shouting incoherently, pounding his fists against the thick, reinforced security glass, as the guards firmly pushed him backward onto the public sidewalk. I walked straight across the pristine marble lobby and stepped securely into my private express elevator. I turned around just in time to watch the polished silver doors begin to slide shut. My final view of my toxic parents was exactly what they deserved. Two broken, bankrupt narcissists, screaming in absolute agonizing despair, forever locked outside the magnificent empire I had built entirely without them. The heavy doors sealed shut with a soft, definitive click, bringing perfect, unbroken silence to my new, beautiful life. 6 months passed with the ruthless, undeniable precision of absolute justice. The catastrophic fallout from the breached contract and the subsequent legal slaughter had permanently eradicated the fake glamorous empire my biological family had spent decades building. Madison was currently living a profoundly miserable existence in Atlanta. Her highly coveted marriage to Elijah had instantly transformed into a suffocating, inescapable psychological prison. She resided within the walls of a sprawling multi-million-dollar estate, yet she was nothing more than a silent, terrified ghost haunting the marble hallways. The devastating post-nuptial agreement she had signed under extreme duress stripped her of every single marital privilege and financial right. She had absolutely zero access to Elijah's massive investment portfolios or trust funds. Her designer credit cards had been permanently deactivated and shredded. Instead, she received a strictly controlled, humiliatingly meager weekly allowance that was micromanaged directly by Josephine's ruthless team of corporate accountants. Every single penny Madison spent on basic everyday necessities was heavily audited and scrutinized. Elijah treated his new wife with absolute freezing indifference, speaking to her only when logistically or socially required. During the rare mandatory high society galas she was forced to attend, Madison stood silently in the corner, completely stripped of her previous arrogance. She lived in constant, agonizing fear of uttering a single wrong word, knowing the entire elite circle whispered behind their hands, fully aware that she was a financially bankrupt fraud, trapped in a gilded cage of her own making. Miles away from that Atlanta estate, my biological parents were living their own personalized version of absolute hell. Evicted from their sprawling suburban fortress and stripped of their prestigious country club memberships, Caroline and Harrison were forced to rent a cramped, dilapidated two-bedroom apartment on the decaying industrial outskirts of the city. The walls of their cheap, depressing rental were paper-thin, allowing their neighbors to hear their constant, vicious screaming matches. Without the comfortable buffer of stolen wealth and fake social status, their marriage had rapidly deteriorated into a toxic, inescapable war zone of mutual hatred. They spent their miserable days aggressively blaming each other for their spectacular, highly public downfall. Harrison, the man who had once arrogantly demanded I drain my life savings for imported wedding flowers, was forced to take a humiliating entry-level retail job at a local hardware store just to keep the electricity turned on. He spent his shifts taking direct orders from store managers who were half his age. Caroline, the woman who once bragged endlessly about her designer handbags and exclusive event invitations, now spent her mornings aggressively clipping grocery store coupons at the kitchen table. She had sold off every single piece of her luxury wardrobe, her jewelry, and her pristine shoes, just to pay off the remaining legal fees from their disastrous court battle. They were completely, irredeemably broken, drowning every single day in the squalor and poverty they had always believed they were far too good for. While they suffocated in the miserable ruins of their shattered illusions, I was busy conquering the absolute pinnacle of the fashion world. It was a crisp, electric Friday night in New York City, and a massive section of Fifth Avenue was entirely shut down by the city police for the premier event of the decade. Tonight was the official grand opening gala of the massive, highly anticipated Estelle C flagship store. The architectural masterpiece spanned 3 soaring floors of prime Manhattan real estate. The interior featured sweeping spiral glass staircases custom-cut crystal chandeliers that caught the light like crushed diamonds, and pristine white walls lined with the most exclusive, breathtaking couture gowns on the planet. The pavement outside the towering glass doors was blanketed with a plush velvet red carpet, flanked by heavy security ropes and hundreds of flashing cameras from the global fashion press. I stepped out of my armored luxury vehicle, wearing a show-stopping custom-tailored emerald green evening gown that radiated absolute undisputed power. The flashing lights of the paparazzi illuminated the night sky, desperately capturing the arrival of a self-made billionaire. Inside the magnificent glowing showroom, the air was thick with the scent of expensive white orchids and the joyful, elegant sounds of a live string quartet. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with international royalty, tech titans, and A-list celebrities who had waited years on exclusive lists just to wear my creations. But the most important guest of the evening was not a Hollywood star or a famous politician. It was Josephine. She arrived looking absolutely regal and untouchable in a sharply structured midnight blue suit. Over the past 6 months, our relationship had evolved from a dramatic transactional revelation into a profound, unbreakable mutual respect. She had seen my ruthless business acumen firsthand, and she deeply admired the clinical, unapologetic precision with which I had dispatched my abusers. We shared a warm, genuine embrace right in the center of the glittering showroom. When the time came for the official inauguration ceremony, Josephine stood proudly by my side. Together we held the oversized, polished golden scissors and sliced cleanly through the massive silk ribbon, blocking the grand staircase. The entire room erupted into deafening, echoing applause, officially cementing my total dominance in the global luxury market. As the lavish, triumphant celebration reached its peak, I gently stepped away from the overwhelming praise and the endless clinking of crystal champagne flutes. I walked through a set of heavy soundproof glass doors and stepped out onto the private wrap-around balcony overlooking Fifth Avenue. The cool, crisp night breeze brushed against my skin, carrying the vibrant energy of the city. I stood near the reinforced glass railing, holding a delicate flute of vintage French champagne, and looked down at the rushing river of yellow taxis and endless ambition flowing through the heart of New York. I took a moment to absorb the sheer, undeniable magnitude of my victory. I had not used illegal schemes or physical violence to defeat my abusers. I had used my pure, undeniable talent, an airtight legal contract, and an absolute freezing cold boundary to protect myself. I had personally acted as the surgeon of my own life, meticulously and ruthlessly slicing away the toxic, cancerous tumor that was my biological family. I had stopped begging for a seat at a table that was built on lies, and instead I had constructed a massive, untouchable empire where I was the undisputed queen sitting on the throne. I raised my crystal flute to the glittering, towering Manhattan skyline, taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip of the expensive champagne. It tasted like absolute freedom. It tasted like unparalleled, glorious power. I smiled into the cool night air, relishing the flawless perfection of my new reality. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply letting toxic people drown in their own fake reality. The profound lesson embedded in this remarkable journey is the devastating but liberating truth that biological ties do not automatically guarantee unconditional love, respect, or loyalty. For decades, the protagonist was subjected to a relentless cycle of psychological abuse, blatant favoritism, and financial extortion by the very people who were supposed to protect her. However, her ultimate victory was not achieved through malicious retaliation, physical confrontation, or lowering herself to their deeply toxic level. Instead, her magnificent triumph was rooted in the absolute mastery of her own self-worth and the establishment of impenetrable, legally binding boundaries. Society frequently conditions us to forgive and forget when it comes to family, pressuring us to endlessly turn the other cheek just to maintain a fragile fake peace. But this narrative completely shatters that dangerous expectation. It teaches us that walking away from a highly abusive environment is never an act of selfish surrender. It is the ultimate courageous act of self-preservation. You simply cannot heal in the exact same toxic environment that deliberately broke you. The protagonist reclaimed her absolute power the very second she stopped seeking validation from individuals who were firmly, aggressively committed to misunderstanding her. Furthermore, the story brilliantly illustrates that the most lethal, satisfying form of revenge is simply stepping aside and allowing narcissistic people to drown in the natural, catastrophic consequences of their own horrific behavior. When you remove yourself as their emotional punching bag and financial safety net, their entire fabricated reality inevitably collapses. True, undeniable power lies in silence, calculated strategy, and massive personal success. Your energy is a highly valuable currency, and it should only be invested in those who genuinely recognize and celebrate your worth. Sometimes the most beautiful, untouchable empire you can ever build is a life completely free from the people who actively tried to destroy you. Have you ever had to draw a hard, unforgiving line and walk away from toxic people to protect your own peace and build your success? Share your empowering story in the comments below, and do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to join our community of strong, unbreakable individuals.